G'day podcasters, welcome back to Season 6 of True Blue Conversations with your host Adam Bloom, the author of Easy Target, now available at adambloom.com.au. 8 years ago, after returning from 3 tours of Afghanistan and then gaining experience and education in financial planning, Warren Loudon teamed up with fellow veteran Dave Vaughan and started Loudon and Vaughan Private Wealth, founded with the underlying belief that every person matters and every dollar counts, providing comprehensive tailored financial advice and wealth management services for you and your family. Loudon and Vaughan will guide you towards your financial goals with integrity and transparency. Whether you're planning for retirement, investing for the future, or managing your family's wealth, they've got you covered. Visit loudonandvaughan.com.au or call 02 9538 2704 to book a meeting with Warren today.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue. Today we pick up on part 2 of our conversation with 2nd Commando veteran Andy Steele. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back and hear part 1 before listening to part 2.
You know, at that point in time, we were starting to do the roof team piece. So when they're starting to get ready to freaking hit the compound, us as the recon element, we're jumping on the rooftops and providing that overwatch, that high ground advantage. And they're, you know, blasting into the compounds and taking the fight to the insurgencies that are held within. So that's what that rotation looked like, mate.
So you're over there, mate. Bergs is over there in 08. Geordie McCallum, previous guest of the podcast. And, yep. Mate, talk me through, like, some of the memories you have with Geordie, but also the day that Jason Marks was killed and how that affected you personally.
Yeah. So, needless to say, Bergs and Geordie, they were part of Hot Purse rotation. I think that was 6. I don't know. I'm sure someone will correct me on it. Whatever it was. But as a guy that hadn't set foot into Afghanistan yet, regardless of where I'd come from and different taskings, I really leaned on Bergs and Geordie because these guys were starting to come back from Afghanistan with a trip under their belt. And, for someone like me and many others, like, hey, man, like, while we've been pretending that we've been killing it up on black rolls, you guys have been down here in green rolls, and you've actually been schwacking dudes over here. So what does that look like? What is it that you can get me plussed up on in order for me to be prepared to be effective when we get clashed up against the insurgency network? So, talking to Bergs, he was, I think he was a team commander, had his own team by then in one of the assault platoons. Geordie, like Berg said, he was a gunner and one of the assaulters in Berg's team. Geordie and I got along well with each other, but, just the nature of the beast, there were similar characteristics that him and I got on really well. So, again, what does it look like, mate? You're one of the younger pups in the unit, but I'll take anything from anyone I can get. You're one of the high valued guys that I've got a lot of time for. Help me help the bigger picture. So there was a lot of that going on. Muzz Turner, he was one of the senior team commanders in one of the platoons back on that trip, and he was in the same boat I was in. So he was one of the assault team commanders on tag during the Commonwealth Games. So a lot of experience, but yet to be validated on combat operations. So he was validating his live real combat ops on that trip as well. And with that being said, Muzz and I having a good relationship of being on team together, him being one of my mentors, we're trying to navigate that space as well. Like, hey, we're good at black roll. We're, good at shooting stuff good. targets and blowing shit up, domestically, but what's that going to look like when we're faced against the real enemy? So, Muzz and I are talking about that sort of stuff, and, the war fighting season is really starting to come, into the brink. We've been on a few ops. We've been out there, kicking dirt, dropping bombs, and a couple of, very low threat engagements, long range engagements maybe with, squirters, bloody observers from the high ground, that type of thing. But, we've been, trundling around now, hitting a few dry holes, doing those DAs where, we're just not coming up with anything that's good yet. And, we're starting to scratch our heads, and we're out on a patrol. And, the reason why I bring up Muzz is because Muzz was Jason Marks' team commander. He was the second in command of Muzz's patrol team. And, we're out in the desert on an op, we're probably a few weeks in now, and, Muzz and I are like, all this fluff, mate. Here we are. We've got Afghan dust on our feet. Where are all these dudes that, we've been told that we've been recalled to the dance floor to schwack here in the Badlands, and, there's nothing. Like, it's all bullshit. It was like the man upstairs was listening. So this was, I'll keep this one short and sweet, and we can maybe come back to that because I want to kind of keep on point with the day of, the unfortunate events of Marksy. But, we finally got into a shootout, and it was pretty decent, and we can kind of circulate on that one. But specifically this one, we, as the recon element, we'd split. Normally we're a 6-man packet. We broke off into a 3-man. So my patrol commander, he went off with like a command element, a headquarter element, to be able to provide the eyes and ears and some of the recon skills for them while they kind of managed the battle space. I took myself, 2 of the other recon guys, and a couple of snipers up onto some high ground to pretty much mirror what the other recon element was doing with the headquarter element, and just getting eyes on the battle space, just getting visual imagery, just being able to talk on any specific information, and allowing, the main force element some awareness and some information before they, step into whatever square they're about to step into. So, we're up on the feature. We can see stuff. I've finally been, baptized by gunfire. So now I know that, there are bad guys outside the wire, and, we're up on the high ground, and we're observing guys that have got belt-fed machine guns a couple of ridges across. It's confirmed. We've confirmed personnel that they're bad guys, that they have intent, they have purpose. We can lock in that they're enemy. And, at this point in time, we've just been told, hey, don't engage. These guys are providing us, information. If you shoot them off the mountain, then that information will obviously be no longer available. And, with that being said, as we all know, without getting too much classification, at that point in time, Australian, we could interdict communications that the insurgency network was using, and by them speaking to one another, we can get onto their network, their channels, and we can listen in, and we can plot and, use our cunning ability and strategize their actions, and counter that by us doing things that they don't think that we're able to listen to. So you get my point. So all of this is going on. We truly feeling like we're in a low threat environment. And again, this is Andy being Andy, being super vulnerable and a shitty soldier. And me and the boys like, oh, look, I'm the king of the castle right now. So I've got full authority. Like, boys, it's a hot day. You can drop your freaking body armor. Let's just freaking run clean skin so we can maintain a bit of, longevity and, not get too hot up here. There's not much freaking shade. So let's, reduce sweating our asses off. So we're dropping freaking protective equipment like it's going out of fashion. And, the day continues to evolve, starts getting hotter. There's indicators on the battlefield that are gradually starting to change. You know, we're bedding in mortars from behind us to make sure that they're good to go if anything goes wrong. And then, you know, while all this is going on, you've got that assault element. So you've got Muzz and Marksy and the rest of those lads. They're, you know, like I circle around to that comment, and I think for the listeners that aren't really exposed to this, when we were out there, you know, the insurgency network, they're not freaking stupid, right? They know that we have firepower superiority. Whether it be small arms, one-on-one, we're going to shoot the shit out of them. In addition to, we're rolling around on cars that have got heavy weapons. We've got javelin, freaking tank busters. We've got grenade launchers, you name it, right? We've got the upper hand. In addition to that, we have what they call the hand of God. We have close air support. They know that we have aircraft on station that if we get the shit and they start to take freaking the shit out of us, we can just call them on and we'll blow them off the ground. So in order for us to induce contact, we have to start taking, now I need to be careful saying this because I don't want to make it difficult for, you know, upper decision makers to feel like they're making bad decisions. But what I'm getting at is they need to make acceptable risks, calculated risks, to be able to put themselves in a calculated, vulnerable position in order for, like I said, expert Toddy would allow the insurgency network to raise above the threshold. So with that said, you know, Muzz and the lads, they're pushing their vehicles towards that threshold, right? Pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing until we get that connection. And that connection that they reached, that threshold that they reached, was a perfect bear trap. And when I say a bear trap, I'll kind of break it down. We're dealing with, you know, we didn't know this right there and then, but these are Mujahideen tactics that they used against the Russians. It's like a triangular ambush where they take the high ground, you on the X, i.e. Australians, Muzz, Marksy, the boys in the low ground on the X with multiple insurgents firing from multiple locations, very closely, you know, described as a three-way ambush, and that is where they've found themselves. And, you know, to put it plainly, just to get everyone aware, it was on like frickin' Donkey Kong. This is probably maybe 4:30 in the afternoon. Sun is still good, and they're in the frickin' shit. Multiple firing positions with the enemy, the insurgents, firing with heavy weapons, RPGs, small arms, not just from high positions, but also from close positions within the greenbelt, down within the compounds, down by the river, down within the greenbelt, you know, firing from trees, behind trees. So, you know, there's a lot going on. And us as the element on the high ground, we don't have the best visual, nor do we have the weapon systems to be able to provide any effective or sustainable gunfight to any of those enemy positions. So with that being said, we're trying to coordinate mortar fire with the mortar element. And with that being said, mortars got a little confused and they started to drop rounds on our position. And as soon as we heard the first mortar drop about 30 meters from where we were sitting, we knew that the second one, when we heard the tube launch it, that there was a second one coming. So that created a bit of confusion and fear and tomfoolery up on the high ground we are. And guys are like, what do we do? And it's like, man, just hold your ground. Like, if you're going to get blasted, you're going to get blasted. So, you know, back to what I was saying, you know, get your freaking kit back on, lads. Get your armor back on. Get behind guns. Get behind glass. Be prepared to start engaging. I'll start giving you target indications on what we've got. So, with all that going on, the second mortar round landed. We're all good. However, I'm telling them to check fire on the net. I've told them, I'm throwing red smoke to confirm our position and to quit engaging. We are friendly forces. And with all that being said, as soon as I threw that smoke, mate, you knew exactly what was happening. As soon as that red smoke popped, that key feature that myself and 1, 2, 4 other guys, so 5 of us were on, yeah, we were getting saturated in everything from PKM, gunfire, RPGs to small arms. They knew where we were. They knew exactly that red smoke was from opposing forces, which was us, and we were pinned. We had no ability to go anywhere, and, of the limited cover that we had, which was small rocks, at best, the largest were probably the size of watermelons and small folds in the ground. We had very little to provide any protection from. And every time that those rounds were hitting those, they would continue to disintegrate. And all you could smell was disintegrating earth and discomfort, to say the least. So, yeah, we were pinned. We couldn't provide any support to Muzz and the lads. Cavs, the Dutch Apaches, I can get onto that in a little bit. They wouldn't fire due to their rules of engagement. They needed to get proof of identification. And I to this day, I still don't know what they couldn't see that we could see and why they didn't fire. I don't know, but it was pretty obvious who the guys that had Australian multicam were and the guys that were on the high ground firing, but they didn't fire. So that was an issue in itself, and there was some pretty deep after action disputes with that one. But with all that said, down in the bowl, as you well know, Muzz's team were in the thick of it. Unfortunately, Marksy was KIA on that one. They got, I think it was like 7 wounded on that one, ranging from getting shot in the arse to, rounds getting shot through forearms, that type of thing. And for us, as the recon element up there, we were pinned. We couldn't move off until the break of darkness, when the firing could no longer be effective. They got no visual on us, and we had to exfil under the cover of darkness under NVGs. And yeah, obviously when we got back down to our location where the rest of the force element were, we knew that we'd lost Marksy. We knew that there was obviously a Kazovac to get Marksy out of there, in addition to the guys that were wounded in action. And yeah, so that was pretty difficult, mate, to know for the first time that we'd experienced the shoe on the other foot. Usually, we were handing out the arse kickings, and this time it didn't work in our favour. So we pretty much skull dragged ourselves back to TK that night with a whole bunch of vehicles that had shit the bed. I think some of our ATVs, we were, just daisy chaining those bad boys because, we'd flipped a couple of ATVs, cartwheeled those down off the side of some vehicles just through, bad terrain and, mechanical malfunctions that brakes weren't working and whatnot. And yeah, as a force element, we returned to TK to lick our wounds, do a ramp ceremony for Marksy and get the appropriate treatment and evacuations for those wounded guys. So there was a lot there, mate. I remember when we got back, it was pretty raw. It was definitely a different emotion, a different aura in the atmosphere. It was the Australian Anzac spirit prior to us going out on that patrol. And then, just mixed emotions of revenge, grief. So you have that stigma. But, with all that said, mate, I want to add, with the grief and the pain and the ramp ceremony and all that going on, when we did take a lot of the cars back to the the repair shop where the mechanics and the armourers were, you know, there was more realisation of how many other close calls there were for other guys that could have been freaking taken out of the fight permanently that day too. I remember one of the cars, and you know, I'll save the name of the guy, but he knows who he is. He was the commander of one of the vehicles, and there was a 7.62 round in the headrest, and you know, the vehicle, this one specifically, was peppered, you know, quite significantly among others. But I remember when I was over there with him, you know, I was taking the piss out of him, going, "Hey man, like that's a close call." And you know, what makes this story so poetic is that this individual was the same individual that I used to bust his balls about ever since knowing him, about being a cigarette smoker. And when I said, "Mate, that had your name on it right there. You could not put a round centered on that headrest better if you could." And I said, "Where were you? What happened?" And he said, "Man, I was behind Mag 58 the whole time, taking, you know, what I could with what I had. And the only time that my head wasn't behind that gun or near that headrest was when my cigarettes fell off the dashboard down into the footwell, and I freaking bent down and figured that if I was going to die, I'm going to die with a smoke in my mouth, and lit up a cigarette." So, like, you know, you can kind of put the pieces into that narrative as you will, that the only reason that cat freaking survived is because he was grabbing a dab from the footwell main. So, yeah, that one was the first introduction to the pendulum goes both ways.
Absolutely, mate. And I know, talking to Geordie, and go back and listen to Geordie's podcast, and go back and listen to Berg's and Muzz's podcast where they talk about this. And it's great to have your insight as well, Andy, of painting that picture of that day. I know Geordie said it himself that he did 4 tours, and he said that day he has never forgotten, one, because you lost Jace, but two, he said, we got our asses handed to us that day. He said of all these tours, he said that day, he said, we absolutely got our asses handed to us.
Yeah, mate. Like, that was my personal second contact, and you know, we can dig into the other ones later on, but I can kind of plus up and add the icing on that one. That contact, I actually had time to be scared. I actually had time to be afraid. I actually had time and space to be in fear of my life, because those rounds and the fire that was coming in, like, was so effective, and I felt so vulnerable and out of control that nothing on my keyboard of combat would have worked to get us out of that. The only thing that got us off that hill that day was the sun going to the other side of the planet. Otherwise, mate, those rocks, they had a shelf life.
Right. And that, mate, putting that into perspective, like that, because how many of yous were out on that? Like, what was the, like, how many, do you know roughly how many the Mujahideen were in that valley that day?
Mate, post-op, you know, however, you know, they grab the intel from whatever sources, you know, in the days after, and the after-action reports that we got, you know, they said that there was at least, you know, a call sign of at least 3 figures, so at least 100 cats that were in there, and they were bedded in, and you know, seeing through the fire lanes that, you know, you couldn't see just through simple concealment of the battle space without being able to walk onto those features. We were in a well-coordinated ambush square that they had coordinated, you know, with their kind of limited technology, years in production. You know, these cats would have been digging out, you know, trenches with overhead protection, with all of the, the nice things to have of a first class defensive position. And we fell into that trap. Like, no, you couldn't have done it any better, and just to add to, the Dutch Apaches not engaging, that just added to the superiority of the ass kicking that we received that day. And, to the point where, I remember up on that hill, one of the guys, and it's funny, and he'll laugh when he hears this, but I remember him and I looking at each other and, him laughing and going, man, I want my mum. And I'm like, dude, this is not looking good, mate. We ain't going to win this grand final. So, that one was a bit of a freaking ball terror, to be honest.
And for you, mate, as you mentioned, you've been in the regiment, for a few years now, and everything that you said, like everything that you'd learned, all your, like, this is your second TIG, like, and this is, your second engagement, mate, as you say, nothing that you could get you to that point, nothing else you could do would stop that ass kicking that day.
No, not at all.
It's just nuts, mate. Like, it's just, like, hearing this is just crazy, like, and because how many, like, your call sign, how big was your call sign? The whole call sign, how many did we have out there in that day?
So, like Berg said, we'd roll out the gate at company size. So 30, 60 plus 20, you're working with about 80 dudes, right? 2 platoons and a headquarter element with a recon platoon and mortars. But on that day, it was kind of split, where one platoon and some of their supporting elements were, out of that battle space. I don't want to say they weren't relied on mutually support that specific movement, but on this day, they were, with time and space being in consideration, they were out of the fight. So they couldn't really support. They were, potentially retasking for another gig. This specific task was to antagonize a threshold in order to create another subgroup to pop above the threshold somewhere else, if that makes sense, without getting into too much classification.
Yeah.
So, in that, I think that was Tina Calais, man, just to be specific. That was the village. That was one platoon. So, 30 dudes-ish, 6 of us. Yeah, maybe, 40 dudes on the ground, and that's split up between, the shitty freaking recon and sniper positioning that myself and the patrol commander of recon with the headquarter element on the high ground were, and then, the other 30 odd guys in the platoon broken up on SRVs down in the low ground with a couple of mortar cars in there with them. So, yeah, mate, like, it was, the odds were pretty rough.
Oh, 100%, mate. And as you mentioned, like, this is what you've heard 2 years before, like Bergs and Woodrow getting into, DA Nile. Like, these are the, you're hearing these stories, and, mate, now you're living this story.
Yeah. And that's the thing, mate. It's like, even to this day, I look back and I'm like, where the frick did they come from? Like, how did they get up there without being detected? Like, we were on the ground all that from about lunchtime onwards, a little bit before lunch, which, the only logical reasoning, for me is that these guys had the discipline to be up there within the same conditions that we were. And like I was saying, like, I'm like, hey, peel your kit off, guys. Like, it's getting too freaking hot, mate, to be up here with all your kit on. These guys were undetected, below the threshold, reducing their signature. Their field craft was good enough that they were under overhead protected, bunkers, if you will, trenches, protected locations for hours on end, and showed that kind of discipline. We weren't just, when we got to this point in the war, we weren't just dealing with, low level fighters. These guys were disciplined. These guys were the ones, and, after actions and, 20 years-ish later, so much information's come out now that is verified. These were the dudes that were fighting the Russians. These were the guys that had the combat experience, that had built that field craft, that had the ideal battle space awareness in order for this trap to finally take effect. So that's what you were dealing with, at that point in time in the war.
All right. And mate, because that how long was that engagement that you're actually on that day? Like, did it go for a long, long time?
Yeah. It went on for at least a couple of hours. I know that there is footage out there online that I'm sure you can dig up. Now that people can hear Bergs' voice from the podcast, you can probably hear his voice in the freaking low ground of that day running towards one of the SRVs. And, us being up there, when that first shot rang out, to us stepping off once it got dark enough, like I said, that was, I said it was probably around 4:30 in the afternoon. So it was easily, probably, 7 o'clock. So 2.5 hours. And the other reason that it kind of ceased is because they got off the X and it got dark enough for them to stop freaking blowing us off the freaking hill.
Yeah, mate. This is why it's important, mate, to record these stories. And so you have that day, mate, and that contact. And is there any more significant firefights that you had on your first trip that you can remember?
Yeah, there's a couple that are worth mention. Kind of reversing the script a bit. We were talking about Muzz and I in one of the locations out in the middle of the desert as a big group, just, circling the wagons and holding up, scratching heads going, what's next? And, as the recon patrol, we'd kind of come into the middle with all of the assault vehicles circling around in a circle harbour. And, I walked out to Muzz and we're like, hey, what's going on? Like, where's all this action? And like I said, the guys were listening, because whether it was the next morning or the next morning after that, we, as the recon patrol, we were tasked to just do a bit of a route recon on a potential path into another valley that opened up to another series of compounds where there was some potential individuals of interest. So, we started to, and, as the recon element, we had a little bit more freedom and a little bit more ease of maneuver because we were on the four-wheelers. We weren't weighted down as much, so we could get off the roads a little bit more and get up into that more treacherous terrain on those four-wheelers and six-wheelers to reduce that threat of IEDs on those vulnerable locations. So, we're kind of like just driving around out in the desert ahead of the platoon and just trying to get an idea of, safe passage, if there's anyone that's on, the high ground providing any information, any ICOM, any spotters, if anyone can see us and they can relay that information through that interception of communication, that type of thing. And, we're just tooting around and, over the radio, we hear that there's been a platform up in the sky. I'm sure, it's Predator or whatever, some other coalition outfit that probably wasn't allocated to Australians as it was. It was just, one of those surprise, hey, we've got something and this isn't a grid square that we've got coalition forces operating in. Let's get a fix on that. And, without getting too deep into the weeds, turns out confirmed, no coalition. We've got 13 suspicious individuals in a military type formation making their way down a road. So, you know, I hear it on the radio, and, you know, Adam, I've heard this bullshit for the last 6 weeks of, we've got, you know, potential suspects doing this and potential suspects doing that, and it turns out, you know, he's just going out to check his freaking livestock, or, you know, everything's been a false alarm pretty much. So I'm at the point where I'm getting pretty pissed off, going, you know, like, when am I going to get to use this paperweight that I've been carrying around the desert for the last 6 weeks, slung it around my neck, and actually start plugging people with holes? So anyway, yep, let's go and check it out. So, about face, you know, pretty much do a 180. I'm like the 2IC, so, you know, and I'm sure, you know, you get the feel, Adam, as a chief of the rural fire service, you've got a whole bunch of itchy trigger finger individuals that are wanting to get amongst it, and you've got to be like the mum, like, hey, oi boys, like, I'm always up for a bit of tomfoolery. I'm always up for a good laugh. I'm always up to take a few risks. But at this point in time, let's not be flipping any motorbikes in the desert and breaking anybody's freaking legs. So I'm trying to manage that. Meanwhile, on the radio, we're getting feed that, hey, you guys need to hurry the F up. These guys are moving pretty quick, and you've got some ground to cover. You guys have got the maneuverability on the ATVs. We're in SRVs, and there's a limited opportunity to intercept these guys. You need to get a move on. So it's turned into pretty much, you know, cannonball run type behaviour of 6 motorbikes covering Afghan desert with rock, you know, decent features. We're pretty weighed down with 84 rocket launchers, mag 58 machine guns mounted on the 6-wheelers. They're pretty gunned up, pretty good to go. So these bikes are at full capacity, you know, with all of our rations, water, enough to suffice on this certain operation, which was like at least a month out in the field. So yeah, back to going full feral. Yep, that's where we're at. And we're freaking powering through as quickly as we can across the desert. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, this is pretty dangerous. You know, it's pretty fun. We're getting to push these bikes pretty hard. There's a potential threat of, you know, some Indians around the corner, and we're the cowboys that are going to take the fight. But I've heard this too many times now. I need to manage my expectations. It's probably another false alarm. So, you know, we've covered the ground. How long that's taken, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, if that. And we start to charge around a corner of a feature, and it gets quiet, and I start to feel something, you know, like that sixth sense that everyone talks about, and it's like the pattern of life in this valley just doesn't feel right. And about, I don't know, a period of time within that space, you hear whistling and the swirling of something incoming from our front, which, you know, I've never seen an RPG fly at me at this point in time, but I've had a quick lesson on what that probably looks like. And yeah, you see an RPG fly between the course line and the formation that we're in, and detonate about, I don't know, freaking 30 meters behind us, followed by, you know, the pitter patter of small arms fire. And sure enough, mate, yep, we're in the freaking shit. So we're taking that, and, you know, the cavalry starts to arrive. The sniper call sign, they start to arrive, and they start to engage threats from where they're positioned. And then shortly after that, that's when, you know, I think Bergs, I'm sure this is in the next phase, but yeah, Bergs turns up with his little outfit, and he starts to get amongst it with the SRVs, and he's down there getting amongst it up close and personal with those 13 that are starting to break off from the low ground in that corridor up onto the high ground. And yeah, we kind of bed in with, you know, every gun that we've got, all vehicles kind of like lined out on the road, and if not on the road, pretty close to it. and, sink our heels in to get into it. So we were kind of positioned off on a flank, more or less just providing overall battlefield commentary. Really, I haven't really shot her off around yet because it's just, too far. Can't really distinguish anything that's worth shooting at because, my gun just doesn't shoot far enough. Bergs and that, they are in the thick of it. They're, down by the road, by the creek line, and, the bad guys are, within freaking 25 to 50 meters to their front. And then there's others that have started to make their way up onto the high ground. As they're doing that, I start to get called on that there is a cave-like complex halfway up the feature, and get the call to, get that 84 ready to go. So this is my first time to shine. So yeah, I crack off a couple of 84 rounds up onto a cave-like feature with a rock in front of it, and, kind of settle that down a bit. The guys that are down where Bergs are at, he's kind of calmed those cats down, but again, I don't really have enough visual to know exactly what that looks like. I can just hear it over the radio. And while that's all going on, mate, our JTAC, and I don't know whether he's popped his head into the public arena, so I'll keep his name out of it for now. But that's when he called on that freaking A10. I think it's Kimmy Campbell, if I've got her name right. Not that I know that at this point in time, but her and her freaking wingman were on station saying, hey, where do you need it? And so he's starting to scramble aerial assets to getting them on station. I can't remember, and I'm sure Berg will give me a kick in the ass where it's due, but there was some issue with them dismounting, and I think maybe it was because they had the weapons platforms to be able to provide suppressive fire onto the adversaries that were on the high ground, and that's why they didn't dismount and assault. But us as the recon element, we got recalled at the dance floor to, hey, come on down, and you guys assault the hill. So, yeah, mate. I've popped off a couple of 84 rounds, and I've got an idea of where these bad guys are at, and we get to take the hill. So 6 of us, plus like an intel dude, or head on up. So yeah, there we go. And that's when, effective fire was starting to slip over your heads, which was pretty sweet. I wasn't really afraid because there was just so much going on. I was like all amped up, like this adrenaline thing, like should kick in pretty quick. So I really won't really feel any of this. That didn't happen, mate. Every step that I took at altitude up that hill was a freaking pain in the ass. Hated it. And on our way up, one of the blokes I knew was behind a rock, a bad dude. And I'm trying to tell one of the boys, hey man, we've got a freaking tango, bad guy, behind that rock, and it just didn't compute. So when he moved up, this guy was no longer a threat. He'd put his gun down and he was, shitting kittens type thing. So it was pretty funny because when he did pop the corner of that rock, he freaking shit himself because he just wasn't expecting for there to be a cat there, responsive. He thought that he might have been freaking out of the fight already. So that was pretty funny, man. So there's always those little bit of pieces of humor that, when no one's at a full risk of life, you can kind of let that fall into them because that they've got the upper hand anyway. But, when there's an opportunity to let someone shit themselves under control, that's always good to go. So, yeah, that was that. But, yeah, as we continue to head up, same dude, his weapon malfunctioned. It was a prolonged malfunction. He couldn't use it. So, we had to grab one of the insurgents' AKs, did a quick inspection and it was still functional and good to go. And, I was like, man, gun doesn't work. Sling that bad boy. Use this AK. This is yours now. Treat it like it's yours. This is what we're going to use until we get up there. But, give him some mags, give him an AK, and just rock and roll. So, yeah, we continued to push up onto the high ground. And, while we're moving up the high ground, you've got Bergs and some of the other vehicles that were behind us with the heavy weapons, just suppressing those bad guys as we made our way up. So, that was pretty pretty theatrical, I guess. You've got all that lead flying over your head, not just going their way, but them still managing to spit rounds at us. And as I said, I'm still waiting for this adrenaline to kick off, but no, still got nothing. Still got my ass hanging out. Got up there, and yeah, that was my first interaction with the true effects of collateral damage on humans. So yeah, just clearing the dead. Yeah, a lot there, mate, to unpack. Just firsthand experiencing, what our weapons were capable of doing, and processing, casualties or fatalities of war on the other side, and dealing with, what the human body does once the off switch is flicked. All body function is no longer functioning. So you're dealing with, defecation, urination, all that sort of stuff with people. And yeah, that was a lot there, man. But, that was an experience. Came back down. I think one of the big things from that, as we were going up later on, after the incident, I went and spoke to the communicators, the electronic warfare guys that intercept all the communication. And I think one of the biggest things were this fighting force, where they were very shocked because I think maybe we were intruding into like another coalition's area of operations, and the comment was made that they were surprised, shocked, and horrified that these guys dismounted from their cars and assaulted on foot. So that was a tactical shift that they hadn't expected from, lessons learnt, that whoever these guys were. And I think, at that point in time, I doubt they knew that we were Australians. They just knew that we were freaking, bad guys. That probably changed their tactics, whether that was transferred through other comms means to other fighters in the valley, in the battle space. But yeah, that was a game changer for them. And, that wasn't just the first time for them, but that was the first time for me. But not just getting contact, but getting contact on a motorbike, and then actually dismount, and then actually assault as per military doctrine at the School of Infantry years ago at Singleton.
It's wild, mate. It's just absolutely wild to hear this, mate. And like, as you say, like this is you're in contact, mate. This is, as you mentioned, you've been on tag. You're like the paper targets that you're shooting at, and now you're in. This is it. This is for real, mate. Like those paper targets are real people.
Yep. Yeah. So that was all that. We saw the flex of Kim Campbell bring the rain that day. That was only a piece of that 13 that took the high ground. Others squirted off, went into a creek line, and Kim had issues determining friend or foe on that one. So I pumped, this is pretty important based on the last little yarn I had about being in Timor, not knowing which munitions I'm shooting 40 mil from. So this time I got it right. I fired smoke, 40 millimeter smoke, to distinguish the area of enemy combatants, and I got it right. So this time, yeah, I pumped the right munition, smoke that time, to light up the target for Kim and her wingman to, bring the A10 on station and get them out of the creek line. And then I don't know whether it was, no, it couldn't have been, I don't know. I could be just making stuff up, but yeah, she brought the 30 mil cannon on station that day and wore it out. And then I think there was another call sign that got even higher, and I think they brought in a F-16 or an F-18 to drop a 2,000 pounder on that. So yeah, we got introduced, the baptism of gunfire that day for Andy Steele. I got to see, from my own rifle all the way to, the power of the USA on that contact.
Mate, wow, like just crazy, and like I'm just hearing this, mate, going, wow, this is, and because at this stage, were you 26 at this stage in 08, 26?
So 17, so 20, yeah, mate, yeah, 25, 26
Yeah,
ballpark.
wow, mate, I'm 32 now, and I think back to where I was at 25, 26, mate, actually, I would have, yeah, 26, mate, I would have just become a deputy captain. Like, that's crazy, mate. Like, this is just nuts to hear that you're doing this at, 26 years old. Like, just, facing life and death situations, mate, that, normal 26-year-olds back home, they're not facing that, mate.
Right, yeah. So yeah, it's just, I did a lot of growing up real quick.
100% you did, mate. And so your trip goes on, and you have, as you say, mate, you start the kinetic, like you're in the fight now. Like you at first you're kicking dust around Afghanistan, going, "Are we ever going to get into ticks?" And then, mate,
Yep.
you have a pretty kinetic rest of the trip. And mate, on reflection, you come back, and what do you? How do you think you went, mate? Like, and on reflection and self-reflection, I mean, of how you think you performed.
Yeah, good. That rattling in Chinook when we lost Marksy was a low point, especially, that first introduction on that gunfight that we had that I just spoke about. And then that was pretty much the next one that was up close and personal. That was two polar opposites where, that was a huge victory with no casualties to opposite where we got, 7 wounded and 1 KIA. And then after that, there was, a couple of pieces there, ins and outs. Like I said, nothing that was as significant as the one when we lost Marksy. There was one time when there was a funny story. I won't get too deep into it. Recon patrol, we got tasked to go up and get a bit of eyes on. Turned out to be a false alarm and got caught off pretty quickly, a few hours after the sun came up. And I went off to just get some visual on the feature that we were on. We went on a little bit too far than what I should have. And I was taking a shit, and a freaking filthy freaking spotter started shooting at me while I was freaking doing a shit. Freaking returned fire on that cat. Ran back to the rest of the call sign, and that turned into, "Hey, what are you doing?" There's shooting going on. It's like, yeah, some bloke freaking popped his head up, was rattling off with me with an AK. I had me pants down and bloody had to freaking, return fire and, hustled on back, back to you guys. And, everyone was a bit upset about that, about, you going too far and, you should have let us know and so on and so forth. But, with that one, and then the big hit that we did that I remember was we pushed up into Gizab, which was uncharted territory. And that was like, I think Danny Fortune spoke about that one. He actually came out on that gig. And that was a joint op with the Saskats. They had, their tasking to hit a few key compounds and locations. And, we had our own key tasks and responsibilities to hit a few other compounds. That night, I kind of did, I thought I was doing one of the boys a solid because, he was like, man, I really haven't, had much go on this trip. And I was like, yeah, no worries, man. Usually I'm tail end Charlie. Whatever the case was, I was like, yeah, man, I'll take, the right flank. He stuck in the big ones. I don't know whether he was tired or whatever. And, like I said, he really didn't get much action on the trip. He might have been there, but he didn't really get many rounds off type thing. And it just worked out that he was in the traditional position of where I'd be in the patrol as Arsene Arnold, just carrying up the freaking back end, making sure everyone's good to go. And yeah, sure enough, that night there was some, bad guys freaking in the darkness kind of probing us from the tree line, the creek line into the green belt. And yeah, he got rounds off on that night. And yeah, I was freaking pissed because I was like, man, I was trying to do you a solid, letting you freaking take it easy tonight, having a shit job up the rear and me doing the hard work up on the flank, and you got rounds down range. So, it's just the nature of the beast, man. Sometimes, you got to be, it's a lottery ticket. But, he schwacked a couple of freaking bad guys that night and got the freaking credit for that one. So that was sweet. Yeah, and I was pretty freaking unhappy about that. But, it is what it is. But, the over on that one was like the grandstand grand final Super Bowl of that trip, where, like I said, it was a joint op. It was a SAS and Commando raid. You had the CO, Dan Fortune, the RSM there that actually came out on that gig. It was a big lift, big aviation, heavy movement. And it was like we went in a period of darkness, went in, kicked ass, took names, left that battle space, with, gas stations freaking burning to the ground, compounds just, obliterated, key leadership disrupted, multiple personnel of interest taken off the battle space and returned without any casualties. So, that was a huge win to the end of that trip. How I felt at the end of that trip, I felt validated. I felt, like a true Australian veteran that actually had seen the full capacity of combat now, with nothing really shaped around that kinetic engagements in East Timor, nothing significant in Iraq. But then, stepping into Afghanistan, hearing about all the stories of, it is the wild, wild west over there, and then actually walking through it and living it. Yeah, I, got on that plane back to Australia thinking, okay, yep, I'm an Australian veteran.
Yeah, absolutely. And mate, we're just going to have a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll crack on with the next part of your story, mate. So we'll just have a quick break, and we'll come back. So you come back from your first trip, Andy, and then you separate from the military for a short period. And without going into too much detail, mate, what was that like, and the separation?
Yeah. So I think just trying to explain it away, not too blindly, but just the effects of having a family and that high intensity operational environment. It took its toll on my young family, and the result of that required me to reassess my priorities, which in short required me to transfer from the military, discharge, and move to the States for my family's best interests. And with that being said, it was tough, mate. Personally, it was a priority for the best interests of my family, but as an individual, I wasn't ready to conclude my military service. But as I said, that was my priority, my family. So it was tough, man. It was tough to discharge from the military, even still very young and still feeling like I had a lot more to contribute. I'd been conditioned to get up every day and perform as a sharp instrument, living life full throttle. And, the world had changed from when I left it at age 17. And, needless to say, I had done a complete 180. So with that, and then re-entering, civilian life, I took on the role of being a full-time dad at that point. And, I found that challenging to relate to the outside world and the low-performing, zero sense of urgency way of civilian life. So I had some issues with that. So I had to find purpose, man, and produce a way or find a way to produce perfect results in everything I did. You know, whether it be routine with the babies that at that point in time, being an ultimate dad. And, you know, if you want to dig in, you know, what does that look like? You know, polished floors of the house, you know, items in the fridge, like had a dedicated location, like in Kapuka. Everything had its place, you know, and like I said before, like I had that serious OCD, ADD mix. So yeah, it was a transition, man. I still like plugged myself into the unit, and that was around the time that the name change happened. So I was fully aware of that, and you know, some of the current actions in theatre and the redirection of the war effort now that it had reset into counterinsurgency. So like I covered off on my first gig, it was out there just pretty much trying to lower the, you know, it was like a, you know, lack of a better word, it was a war of attrition. You know, if we can reduce the insurgency network's numbers, then the effect of insurgency, the Taliban, the adverse political sway of Afghanistan will be reduced and governance will take over and take care of itself. But, you know, the counterinsurgency piece was starting to jump in. You know, General Petraeus had been elected to lead that charge, so things had started to change. So, you know, just with all that going on and having, you know, that peripheral connection with the unit, I was asked if I'd be interested to return to the unit. And like I said, I still had an itch for it and felt like I was missing out. I was missing out on what was going on over there. I felt like I was letting the boys down. And I just wanted to get back, you know, neck deep back into it. Otherwise, I'd never forgive myself if I didn't. And I did everything I could to get myself back over there. So with all that said and that proposal and opportunity to get back, I had reached a point where my family was conditioned, I guess, was happy, was aligned, was comfortable, was all the enablers had been set, everything that I had set out to take care of and reset and put all of the pieces in play for them to continue to function appropriately were all there. That was a conversation that I had, and it was agreed, yep, okay, let's head on back and let's, you know, get back in the unit. So that's what I did, mate. I did what I needed to go through the readmittance back into the military, and that consisted of the unit connecting with, I guess it was like some sort of recruiting network. I moved back to where my parents, my dad lived, and set my family up out of my dad's home, and, you know, had to go through all of the fitness requirements to get back into the army, you know, fast track through all of that. I showed, you know, I'm still fit, still capable, still, you know, got the aptitude, still got the abilities, so on and so forth, got the green light for that. And yeah, the transition was over pretty quick, and I was spat back down to the unit. And, you know, the changes that had been made at face value was the new name change, man, was the biggest one. I'd only just missed out on the ceremony of the name change, but, you know, walking in, you know, getting issued a uniform again, you know, I still had my beret, you know, took that out of, you know, a trunk or a shadow box or whatever the case may be. And, you know, hey man, you know, that's not the badge we use anymore, you know, not to take away from the RAR skivvy badge, but, you know, we're not using that one anymore. We've got our new unit badge. Here it is. Sort yourself out, get that one plugged in, and away you go. So that was kind of the intro back into the unit.
Yeah, right. And then, mate, but you come back into the unit in a different role now. You become a team leader in Alpha Company, mate. Bit of a different role from when you left, and talk me through the challenges of you're a team leader now.
Yeah, mate. So, what did that look like? So I got back in and kind of sniffed around I think, one of the first places I went to was the guard room. And funnily enough, the guard room NCO was Mick Craig, who is we've unfortunately lost now. And he was my team commander in Iraq. So he was now the company sergeant major of Alpha Company. And, he was kind of one of the individuals that made things work for me to get back into the army. So, I spoke to him and he's like, we've got whatever company over in Afghanistan at the moment. We're pitched to be the next pets that are rolling over. We've got a lot going on, had a new name change. I'm the CSM Alpha Company. Things that have changed since you left. We've got the full rotation on the tag. So it's not just the trickle system now. It's a full company rotation now. So with that being said, Alpha Company isn't fully resurrected. We don't have the numbers. So what we'll be doing is taking the current reinforcement cycle guys that finish. They'll be filtered into the company. And then whatever we don't have from that, we will backfill with guys that are on the current rotation in Afghanistan that they'll ask for volunteers for guys that just want to jump straight back into the hot seat and backfill the numbers that were short. So with all that going on, sounded good to me. He's like, you want to be one of the assault platoon team leaders? And I said, yeah, definitely. Plug me in. He said, all right, well, with that being said, we've got a bit of time up our sleeve. So he suggested, why don't you head up to Singleton? And at this point, with the progression of the unit, like I said, when I went through, the reinforcement cycle was a little bit out of whack. Now it had been kind of polished and cemented in that, as it was called back then, SFTC would take ownership of that and they would take care of all of that. So he said, why don't you go up? And I was essentially, got a sub posting from 2 Commando Alpha Company to SFTC as a instructor. And, the purpose of that was, 2-part, let's start working on your instructor skills as part of the reinforcement cycle. And you can start to get eyes on, the new up and comers that are going through Rio to see who's doing the zoo and start building, relationships with the guys that are coming into the unit. So that's what I did. I went up to Singleton for a few months and I exercised my instructor, skills on heavy weapons, a lot of the courses, urban, ACQB. At this point, that was part of the reinforcement cycle now. So with all of the information and expertise of becoming a supervisor when I was on team, I was able to fulfill that role and help out, get those guys up to speed. So by the time they finished reinforcement cycle and got posted to Alpha Company, not only had I helped them get the skill sets that they needed, I actually had faces to the names of the guys that were going to deploy with Alpha.
So I want to talk, mate, the lead up training. This is where it sort of starts a pretty shitty period for Alpha Company where, mate, talk me through the death of Mason Edwards on the lead up training and how did that affect you and the company going forward?
Yeah, pretty bad. Like I said, Alpha Company had been resurrected and got the necessary assets to stand up. Obviously, prior to any deployment, there was pre-deployment training. So we headed on down to Coltana, which I'd been to before, prior to heading over on the 08 trip with Recon. Mace Edwards was my second in command of that assault team. I'd known Mason from his initial advanced close quarter battle course a couple of years prior when he went through the reinforcement cycle. This was when it was still that trickle system. Some guys would do ACQB but not actually come to the tag or the Charlie Company at that time. So they would be put on the course, and this was at the time when I was going through and getting my supervisor qualification. So I was one of the director staff on that ACQB course. So I got to know Mason as a student, and so I knew who he was. I knew the kind of guy that I was dealing with. I knew his abilities. I knew the kind of character, the expectations that not just he had of others, but what he could produce, and that accountability piece. So when I found out that Meso was going to be my 2IC, I thought, solid pick, good guy. This is going to be good. We mutually support each other. This is going to be a good trip. But, on that trip to Coltana, October 20th, 2009, he was killed on a training exercise, and it was like absolutely devastating, mate. Not just the essence of what happened, but, working on Meso that night until the care flight bird arrived, that was just unforgettable. I took the loss of Mace pretty hard, and I still do. That night still haunts me. It was a big hit on our team. It was a big hit on the company and the unit. We all felt that loss. And specifically, I remember writing the letters to his mum and dad and his lovely fiancée, Cass. And that took a lot out of me and really made me question myself and brought some demons along with it. I had some great support around me, and, guys like Mick Craig, with him being the CSM, Mick Bainbridge, who he's the New South Wales president. He was in the stack that night. He was one of the guys in the team. Nick Hill, he definitely wasn't part of the company. H, he wasn't part of the company either, but, as we started to coordinate the funeral proceedings, the unit really came together. Guys that weren't deployed, we all went up to Brisbane to go through the military ceremony for Mace's funeral. So a lot of those guys gathered around me, and, with the history that we'd had, I, relied on them a lot to really stand me back up and, get the dust off me and get back into it. So, that was a lot, mate. They all helped me in different capacities and helped me to find my way back. The foundation, though, to be honest, of me navigating my way back was my strong Christian faith. And then the Commission of Inquiry was a long, grueling process that was after that. And that was a lot to take in as well, mate.
Mate, I appreciate you sharing that, and I know how hard that is for you. And I thank you for being vulnerable, and and I'm trying for the listener, mate. Like, you've got all this happening, and you're getting ready to deploy again to a war zone.
Yeah.
The mental resolve that you have to have for that. That's what I'm trying to get across to the listener, mate, that you've just lost, one of the guys out of the company in lead up pre-deployment training, and you have the funeral, and then you're about to bang it in back in Afghanistan. Like, mate, as you said, you talk about your faith that it helped you, and we're going to get later down the track of your transition and how much faith has helped you, and I know it too, and how it's helped me. But that for you, mate, that's really hard, and like, you've now got to process, okay, I've got to switch on here, I'm about to deploy again. Looking back now, mate, was that probably the toughest part of your military career up to that point?
Hands down, mate. Adam, that was at the time, and looking back with years of so much time to analyze that night and everything that went into it. That was the hardest point of my military career. And, even with the commission of inquiry and the findings that it was a systematical error, I still, as the team commander, it may not have been my fault, but I still take full responsibility for what happened. And, I took that role and still do as anyone's keeper very seriously. And, that night I still feel like I'm responsible. He was one of my guys and I let him down regardless of what systems had failed. That's just the way that I'm wired, man. And that's just one of those things that I've had to endure, since losing Mace that night.
I think it's a really good point you touch on there, mate, is that that's leadership, mate. Leadership, like I know it myself being a deputy captain, or I was a deputy captain before I stood down, that the buck stops with you. That's leadership, mate. That's what leadership is. You take that responsibility for your guys. That's what it's about.
Yep. Yeah. So digging myself out of that, the commission of inquiry, like I said, it was pretty brutal, mate. There was a lot of stuff that happened that night that I wasn't aware of. Like I said, there was a lot of systematical issues that were unveiled and came to the surface through that. There were some changes to our team, a specific individual, and not getting into too much. I didn't go on that trip, and I'll leave it at that. But with all that said, and the dust settling for the time being, it wasn't until I think years until the final findings were revealed. The show must go on, and I was identified that, hey, you're good. As long as you can get yourself back on the train, man, we want you to lead this outfit in a few months in Afghanistan. So I said, okay, I appreciate that. Let me work with some of my internal demons and just give me, the weekend to think about it, pray about it, consult good counsel, that type of thing. And it was part of my resurrection to deal with that. And one of those things was to speak separately, independently to the guys that were in that stack that night that were paneled to deploy on that trip under my command, and just talk to them and say, hey, the commission inquires over, man on man. This is not a professional discussion. This is a personal discussion. If there's any doubt in your mind, in my lack of ability to lead, if you've got any reservations whatsoever about my ability to lead you on operations, to command you in combat, let me know. Because this is the time that I need to know that we're solid, and that's the pathway forward that needs to be addressed right here on safe ground before we get over there. So, with all that, the guys, blessed me off and saying, hey, we're good, man. Let's get over there and get amongst it, and let's make sure that we honour Mason in a way that he would be proud of, and go over there and get the job done. So that was like a huge part of me getting back up and learning from what happened and intensifying the seriousness of the job that we did, not just overseas, but at home in training as well, to get up back into it.
So that you get settled, and then you deploy in 2010, mate, and you're involved in some pretty big battles, mate, here. The Battle of Shawali Kot. And talk to me about this operation, mate, and how it had changed, how the mission profiles changed from 2008 to 2010.
Yeah. like I said, when I was out stateside, I was still plugged in to the situation, not just on the world stage, but within the unit, and seeing how the battle space began to change. Like I said, there was the big push of counterinsurgency. A big part of counterinsurgency is partner forces. So we still had a space of Afghans in the patrols at a reduced capacity back in '08, but that had stood up by, political diplomatic arrangements with President Karzai and so on and so forth. I can't really dig too much deeper into that, without speaking above my head. But long story short, it was all about, yes, this is a coalition involved campaign, but it needs to be Afghan led. So you guys can continue to assist in the stabilization of Afghanistan and resurrecting a good government, so on and so forth. But we need to have the faith of Afghanistan at the forefront. So what did that mean to us? That meant that any time that we, and I'm just talking, Australians, it's inclusive on all coalition forces, but for us, Australia, any time that we went out the gate, we needed to have a ratio, and I can kind of save you the grief on that, classifications and whatnot, but we always had to have Afghans. So my role on that one had transitioned from being a assault team commander to the lead partnering force liaison. So what did that look like? There was an organisation that stood up for the SOTG called ATF 666. Can't remember what it was, Australian Task Force 666. And what that pulled from was the provincial police, regional or reserve corps. And what that meant was the police force of the surrounding area of TK, where we were in Oruzgan province. And that was under the command and organisation of Matullah Khan. So Matullah Khan, if you Google that cat, there's controversy between him and Australian interests and so on and so forth, and not to get too bogged down on that, but it was like there was a mutual beneficial agreement where Australia and whatever decision makers decided, yep, this guy's a warlord. There might be some history of some wrongdoings here, there, and everywhere, but at the end of the day, this guy is the face of Afghanistan. Let bygones be bygones. He's got the manpower that we kind of need to make Afghanistan better. And with the blessing off of President Karzai, if he thinks he's good and we think he's good, we'll keep him at, an arm's distance in the best interest of ourselves. But yeah, we can partner up with this guy and we can go out and mutually benefit one another and take the fight to Afghanistan and start fixing the place up. So with all that said, mate, I took point on that as the lead, and that established the SRT, so the Special Response Team. So that was, what we called the TK SWAT. So we trained them up, a little bit better than the average Joe with CQB for them to be able to do similar to what we do and to be able to lead Australian forces on those direct action roles, time-sensitive targets, that type of thing. And what that consisted of was it was like an 8-week academy, we called it. And we'd get these guys in from the Kandak in TK under the management of Matullah Khan, and we'd train them up from, their basic infantry Afghan policing, which was a challenge, basic field craft, shooting, basic medical, basic, soldiering skills to a point where, they could take the fight acceptably, leading forces of Australia into battle. So we got that off the ground. It was pretty successful. The Canadians started to utilise the same concept. We got General someone, Petraeus or another, I can't remember the name, it escapes me at the moment, to come down, and he was pretty stoked with the result. And that came out like one of the later on outcomes to influence what they were doing in Kabul. And I can cover off on that a little bit later on. But, yeah, that was part of it, that anytime that we rolled out the gate, we needed that ATF 666 component for any of the operations that we were doing. The other difference was the IED threat, man. So gone were the days of us rolling out the gate on ATVs and soft-skin SRVs and LRPVs. It was either up-armoured Bushmasters, or if you can get the assets available and allocated, Helo Ops. So that was the significant change to 08 to 10 now. Bushmasters or Helo Ops. And that was good. That was a decent little change. Operations, you know, you weren't out there months on end. It was fly in, fly out, you know, back in time for breakfast if you're doing night ops. So that was a luxury. And, you know, we were starting to really see the effects of the IEDs and the threats to the RTF and the MTF with conventional forces. And that's what really influenced that. The other thing, mate, that was starting to pop was the green on blues. And, you know, for the listeners that don't know what that means, that was where we had our Afghan partnering forces, specifically conventional forces with Australia and other forces, where your Afghan partners were starting to be influenced by the insurgency and networking themselves into the system and shooting and causing, you know, collateral damage inside the wire. And Australians took significant casualties because of that, with Afghan insurgents under the disguise of friendly Afghans and killing Australian soldiers. So that was the redirection of the tactics of the insurgency there, mate. And that created its own complexities with Matullah Khan and the screening processes for us as we recruited those guys that were going to step in as partnering force candidates for ATF 6. And there was a lot of behind the scenes screening and intelligence gathering with our own guys. And that really broke down into, you know, not to drill too deep into it, but where the money is, mate. At the end of the day, Australians, we were paying those Afghan police a wage for them to participate in their own war. And, you know, it was if not weekly, at least a couple of times during the working week for them, a question to some of those key leaders on, hey, what's the going rate for the insurgency? What are they paying their fighters? And we need to keep above that, because it really did. It just came down to a monetary fight, mate, where the highest bidder is going to get the product. So we had that, and you're dealing with Afghans that are very different. You know, I'd go on patrols once we did get operational, and everything is money to them. So we'd issue them, you know, 5 mags of AK ammo, and we might go out on a patrol or go out on a hit, and it might be a dry hole, no shots fired. We come back and pack up their gear and let them go home and be like, hey man, you know, speak to my interpreter and go, hey, ask him, you know, where's his 5 mags of ammo? And they'll be like, oh, well, we shot it. And it's like, no, mate, we didn't get it. We didn't get any shootouts. Where is it? And it's like, well, you need to find out, because if he doesn't tell us the truth, then we're going to tell MK that there's an issue and his discipline is a lot worse than ours. So he needs to face up and tell us what's going on. So, you know, it'd go around the backwards and forwardsing, and it'd turn it, well, we sold it to the guys down at the market because, you know, they give us money for it. So there were the kind of issues that we were dealing with, mate. You know, the equipment, they'd sell their boots, they'd sell their equipment. So a lot of that stuff then it'd have to be, hey man, you give all your gear back. So that was the kind of stuff that we were facing, mate. And then the other issue that I faced being, now it's just 2010, I'm 27, 28 years old. I'm still looking pretty young, even among my peers. Having these guys who, in accordance to them, there's some truth to it. There's some embellished fact to it, I guess, that I'd be facing Afghans that would be coming in and be candidates to be part of the partnering force representing Afghanistan and looking at me going, you're the leader. I've got my youngest sons are older than you. We've been fighting wars in Afghanistan my whole life. I've been shot 3 times and they're showing me scars on their body, their arms, their legs, saying, and we have you, a baby-faced foreigner, coming in to tell us how to fight a war. So there was those challenges as well, mate. And how did I overcome that? It was a simple case of taking them down to the training area, and on the base, we had, I guess, great fabricators that built koala wall compounds that looked very similar to what we saw out on the job. And we used that as training facilities. And I just put them up in a podium area where they could watch from a distance and say, hey, watch this. This is how we fight wars in, Australia, America. And this is how we're going to fight Afghanistan. And, you get one of the Australian teams to do a demonstration on CQB on how to clear a building and, blow down walls and do all that. And, at the end of that, they saw it and it's like, hey, who wants to do that? And, we're pretty much getting them to eat out at the palm of their hand, go, hey, we want to fight. We want to know how to fight the insurgency. We want to know how to fight the Taliban like that. So that was it. It was like, I might be young. I may be what appears to you inexperienced, but we have something that we may be able to offer you, and we can somehow meet in the middle, because there's stuff that you're going to bring to us that's important, and we have stuff that's important to you that we can bring as well.
Are you a corporal at this stage, or are you a sergeant at this stage?
I'm a corporal.
So being a corporal, mate, 28 years old, and the challenges that you're facing as a leader, and mate, you're having all this internal political things happen with, the partnering forces and like you didn't have this in 2008, and now in 2010 you're having these issues. And as you said, the missions had changed. Mate, talk me through the Battle of Shawali Kot, because that's a battle that is well known, and similar to what Rotation 3 with Bergs and Delta, and then your contact in 2008, and then there's been other contacts throughout Afghanistan, but Shawali Kot is it's well known. So can you talk us through the Battle of Shawali Kot?
Yeah, mate. So once we'd reached that point as the partnering force, we'd got pretty well established. I'd handpicked guys that were worthy of protecting, because we would go out quite limited. Within that team, there would only be 2 Australians within a group of about 8 Afghans. Now, when I say that, it sounds pretty scary, but behind that, you've got other sorties, other helicopters, other platforms where you've got like a reserve, which is that Australian contingent. And that was one of the agreements by Hamid Karzai as president, was like, yeah, we're going to have Afghan be the face of these interactions with the public and chasing the insurgency networks. But as we all know, and I say this because we've passed that now, he knew that we knew that he knew that when push came to shove, if rounds really started to get thrown around, we're still at a point where maybe those Afghans aren't going to stay in the fight. So the Australians will push up through that mentoring force and solve the problem. So that kind of gives you, some of that peripheral understanding of how that works. But with that said, we've been going out and things have been working out pretty successfully. Myself and one other with, a reasonable stack of Afghans getting in decent little stoushes and them kind of holding their own. And I felt comfortable that it wasn't going to be them and an instance where it was going to be green on blue and they're going to start shooting us up. So I can get into one of the operations that we did prior to that later on, but that one was successful, which kind of penciled us in for that series of disruption operations that were circulated around Shawali Kot. So with that one, we flew in. At this point in time, it was frowned upon by the Afghan government for all coalition forces to be doing night raids. So what do night raids mean? It means doing direct action by night, soft knock, hard knock, level 1, level 2 is how they differentiated it. Normally, if it wasn't such a big issue and we could explain away the hostile intent of whoever it was that door we were knocking on, they would have the Afghans and myself take the lead and, knock on the door and ask for, the occupants to come out civilly without, blowing explosively through compound walls or blowing doors or freaking gates off compounds. So that was the regular nature, and it was usually by daybreak. So no more coming in at night time. Let's start being nice and doing it gentlemanly, during gentleman hours by day, which created more risk for us. But, it was what it was. So with all that said, that was the traditional pattern that we were rolling with positive results. Now, with the gig in Shawali Kot, that threshold, all the intel and everything that was going on indicated that, hey, it's justifiable, that we're going to get the Afghan government to sign off that this one, they're willing to accept a hard knock. So switching gears from being polite and gentlemanly, Australia's going to go in and they're going to bang it in. They're going to get the green light by the highest level to blow in explosive breach. So all those approvals went down. We flew in that night, got off the bird. It was pretty close to target. A lot of the time, the birds would drop off out in the middle of the desert where the signature and audibility was far enough away where it wouldn't let the bad guys know we were coming. This time, whatever the case may be, it was afforded that that was an acceptable risk, and those birds pretty much dropped on target. And we got off the bird. For whatever reason, my outfit, we didn't do a hard knock. I think there were some indicators on the ground that didn't warrant a hard knock that was acceptable, and it was at the discretion of the command on the ground that it's not necessary to blow this cat's freaking compound into oblivion unnecessarily. And we negotiated and executed that compound, and I think on that one, I think some of the cats that were in there were pretty sick. I don't know whether it was bad drugs that they freaking got from wherever, but most of these cats were shit house in the animal pen, with needles stuck in their arms and not having a good time. So everyone can kind of get an idea of why we didn't blow in on that one. So with that being said, throwing a bit of humanitarian aid at them and taking care of them, and anyone that was of interest, kind of detaining them and putting them on the birds and rear echelon, dealing with that, kind of worked out into being like more of a follow-on tasking to start clearing out that corridor of compounds. And, being with the partnering force, I was always in the thick of it because that, like I said, we had to be the face of the coalition, and the Afghans needed to be the ones that were doing a lot more of the heavy lifting. And then as we were kind of progressing through that series of compounds, we did have overwatch by, headquarter elements, snipers and other assets that were available. And, just building off what I've already spoken about, there were some indicators there on the radios that were antagonizing the insurgency network. They had eyes on us. They were battle tracking us. They knew, yes, we have the Afghan forces with their, infidel partners making their way down. Once they get to this location, we want you guys to start engaging with the watermelons. And, they had all the little catchwords for, machine gun fire. They had code words for that. They had code words for RPGs, that type of thing. So you got that, on the back burner on the radio. And then, finally, I guess there was an element that were trying to get up into their spotter positions on the high ground. And when I say they, the bad guys were trying to get up onto the high ground, and they failed to identify some of those key overwatch positions of our guys. And those guys got rounds off and dropped those cats. And then from there, mate, it just started to unfold, and it started to unfold quickly to the point where there was a lot of the insurgency network with key leadership around, and they took it as an opportunity to I guess, challenge our abilities. And they really pushed into the fight and made a good day of it. So there was multiple skirmishes within the valley, up close and personal, with multiple of the Aussie teams. And like I said, there was only ours and one other team that had that partnering force, like, with us. So now that it had popped up and there was a lot of fighting going on, we had a lot of those Australian teams just on their own without those Afghan assets available to them in gunfights. And that started to pop up all out throughout the day from all directions. And they were all their own independent, isolated gunfights where things were, just being coordinated at the team level, not specifically at the upper command headquarter level, because it was that complex. There was a lot of, independent insurgency command that were working on their own, and that couldn't be managed at that headquarter level. So it broke down into teams working independently and coordinating their own battle tracking and, orders, improv, on the ground without much long-term planning, hasty planning, if you will, to start to resolve those issues. So with all that going on, I was, in command of my little Afghan outfit, and, we got in some decent little skirmishes on that one. I remember, because you had some guys that were pretty skittish once, rounds started to fly around, and, as usual, sometimes you've just got to take another comment out of Dan Fortune's book, show what good looks like, and you got to lead from the front. So I'm like, hey, this is what it looks like, boys. I'll take point. I need you guys to support me. I'm willing to fight and die for your country. I need you guys to help. So, all those kind of little inspirational speeches kind of pay off. But yeah, on that occasion, RPGs are flying over your head. You're getting into contact, and, just the discipline of Afghan soldiers. And I'm not saying that it's bad. It's just, I guess, experience, exposure, repetition. I was in front. If I hadn't have, done the whole contact reaction, run, crawl, observe, aim, fire, I would have got freaking ripped apart by the commander, the lieutenant of the Afghan partnering force behind me that just let rip a 30 round mag out of his AK, like, from directly behind me. So, in that role, I was, getting shot from not just behind, but from in front. So that was a different experience. And, you're just working with, a different culture, mate. Later on after that, it's like, hey, buddy, that was a little bit squirrely, champion. Let's, how help me understand what happened there. And, to help people understand, their mindset is, Allah, He is the one that is in charge of where the bullets fly. And He knows that they don't need to hit you. So it's like, that's what you're dealing with, mate. It's like, champion, it doesn't work like that. Let's wash off on going full auto when I'm standing in front of you. So you're dealing with that. As that battle continued to evolve, we started to get, the Apaches on station. There were fast movers on station. As the day continued to evolve, we fell into a blocking position where we were holding a vulnerable creek line that was a rat line. When I say rat line, a path that the insurgents were using to, get in and out of one of the areas that we were, dealing with. So we blocked that to reduce their freedom of movement and held that throughout that period of darkness. There was a couple of skirmishes there. Well, we dropped a couple of cats there trying to probe us and see where we were in the hours of that late afternoon. And that fell into the night. I think guys have spoken about resupply. Guys were running out of water, running out of food because the anticipation of the heat, it was just freaking hot, mate. Dudes were running out of water. I was having to deal with the Afghans because, their discipline isn't the best with eating food and drinking water. So I'm having to deal with, doing mum's housekeeping while keeping the insurgencies back from using that creek line to resupply guys that were on the other, feature beside them. And then, that night we just had Apaches just doing strafe runs, around the compounds that we were by the whole night. So, they talk about the impact on the kills and the tally of how many insurgents were neutralized that night. I'm sure there was plenty of actual insurgents neutralized by small arms, by Australian and Afghans on the ground. But that night, I want to say that those AH-64s, those Apaches, they were freaking ripping hard on the high ground, just wearing those pats out. And, as the story unfolds I'm sure you'll get the feed, but I didn't get viz on the freaking SAS patrol when RS got his VC. All of that was being coordinated by, mid to high level command on the next, series of features in the village just across from it. So, they had their own little shootout over there, but all of that was combined on what was going on in that series of compounds, valleys and features on that hit out. But, when you're in it, and that was a series of couple of days, if I remember right, with a decent little walkout at the end, you look back at it and think, that was awarded as a battle of fill in the blank. It was just another day at the office, man. It was just another day of getting off a helo and just reacting to whatever comes your way.
It's just crazy, mate. And I recently had John Wynn on, and I actually did his podcast during the week, actually, mate, just gone. And he actually talks about that. He talks about he ran out of water and, the resupply and how, how bad it was. And he said that's where he could refer back to selection and why you do selection for those moments.
Yeah, for sure, man. And I can kind of relate to that. Being on selection, I'm like, what am I doing this for? But they were the reasons. And as a young pup doing selection when I did it, they're things that I never even considered. I'm going to, in a few years, in less than a decade, I'm going to be having to do, mum's work, housekeeping a bunch of foreigners, keeping them alive, behind enemy lines, for an unknown period of time with limited resources. And it's just that will and that conditioning that allows you to function with the odds against you. And
100%.
I never thought of it when I was going through selection, but the guys that the think tankers that create those courses, there was a lot of thought and there's a lot of purpose in it, and it is created by design to prepare you for that sort of stuff well ahead of time.
100%. And mate, so we have the Battle of Shiwali-Kot, which goes for 5 days from memory, I think it is, and the walkout. And then, mate, I want to go forward to a day that you will never forget, the 21st of June, the Fallen Angel, and the deaths of Scotty Palmer, Tim Applin, Ben Chuck, and the American guy. I forget, his name evades me. Mate, talk me through this day and also the injuries of the other guys on that chopper, and how did this affect you personally and also the company?
Yeah. So that job was a direct result and follow-up of the actions and outcomes of what happened in Shiwali-Kot. And like I said, we had the partnering force and we would kind of rotate. Myself and one other, we'd have a group of dudes that we'd rotate through. So, they're probably, these were the guys that, were on the ground in Shiwali-Kot for, longer than was originally allocated or designed. Like we said, that campaign or job went on for a few days longer than intended. So these guys were probably resting up. I'd let them go home and, take it easy for a few days. And I kind of held down TK and, prepared for next jobs while I kind of high-fived, my second in command, the young fella, can't say his name, but, took Mason's spot and he led with one other of our team, the other partnering force out on that gig. And that was another rota series, flying in by night on to target, no walk in, long walk in, pretty much, the real traditional SF style fly in, hit target, rotor blades pretty much on the X, hitting a target, finding what you needed, getting off target, flying home and being back before breakfast, back at TK. So, the teams were preparing for that one. I was irregular pattern of life. I'm kind of giving them high fives and arse slaps down at the helo pad as they're mounting up, just making sure, everyone's got what they need, so on and so forth. And, I head back to get my head down or start preparing to get my head down and, let them, just wait on the flight line until they get green light to launch. Yeah, I remember just getting my head down and I don't know, it could have been 5 seconds, it could have been, 3 hours. But next thing I know, light of the room's turned on and Mick Craig's come in and he's like shaking me and said, mate, get your gear, come over to the ops room as quick as you can. We've had a fallen angel. And, just sitting here right now, mate, it rattles me still. So, yeah, me being on the reverse cycle of that rotary series, I'm in the sack. Mick Craig comes in, told me to get up, get your gear. One of the birds just got shot down on infill, on target. I ran over, got my kit. The situation became a little bit clearer as I got into the TOC. And, at that time, I'd got 4 killed in action, 7 wounded in action, and the bird just hit the desert floor and it was pilot error. So with all that, I'm trying to just keep, my emotions at bay, just robot mode. Like I've got to get the job done, whatever I need to do. Let's get to it. So Mick, he and I, we flew to Kandahar to take care of Chucky because Kandahar was a little bit closer to where they were flying in at. And, Chucky had obviously perished, but, we needed to take care of business. So I flew down there to bring him back to TK. I stayed with Chucky, that night and I was pretty shattered, man. I knew Chucky, I knew Timmy and Scotty really well, and I had a lot of time for them, and that really rattled me. And with the succession of Meso, there was a lot to carry in such short succession. There was a ramp ceremony for the guys when they headed back. It was super emotional. Several of the guys from the teams went home early to escort the guys that were wounded that could fly home. And obviously the guys, Timmy, Scotty and Chucky, to get them home, and obviously prepare for the funeral and the services that were appropriate for those guys. And duly noted, like, it was a big loss. They were 3 impact players of the unit, and operations continued, and the handover to the next rotation was brought forward to compensate for the guys that were going home. So what I mean by that is, this was at realistically the tail end of the trip. We'd lost Tim, Chucky, Scotty. We'd lost, I can't name them all because some of them are still operational, but, Wilso, he was our electronic warfare operator. Pete Rudlin, he was pretty banged up. And, there's the other guys that I won't talk about, but, that was a huge hit. And, with those guys heading back, in addition to, close mates that wanted to be there to support the families and take them home appropriately, it kind of raptured the force element. So with that being said, I think the executive decision by command was, hey, that's an acceptable adjustment to operations. We're going to continue operations. However, the rotation of the next company, which I think was Delta Company.
Yeah, it was.
Their advanced party to come in earlier and just roll on with those replacements or supplements, so there's no gap in us taking the fight to the enemy. So that's what that looked like, mate. And with that, I decided to stay longer to help with that handover. And, looking back, I think it was a mix of guilt and avoidance to face the pain and grief of the family again, mate. And, I'll get a little bit emotional about it, man, but, it just was such a link to Meso. And the other part was to make up for not being out there that night when the boys freaking crumped in, because, I was inside the wire, on that rotation. So, I just wanted to ensure that Chucky, Timmy and Scotty and the guys that were wounded to death weren't in vain, mate. So, I pushed on. It sounds pretty cliche, but that decision felt like the best at the time. And I felt like I owed them something.
Absolutely, mate. And I thank you for sharing. And I know it was Delta that rotated in, because Muzz actually spoke about that and on his podcast, and he came over, and I know Slats actually spoke about it on his podcast, in that he was part of the ramp service, and he said that it was, so all these stories, mate, are intertwining of, you guys being over there on the ground. And mate, I thank you for sharing that, because I know how hard that is, and I'm just very grateful that you have shared that, mate, and it still affects you all these years later, mate. It still affects you.
Yeah, it does. It never leaves you, man.
Absolutely. And mate, you're in the hurt locker of, that's happened, and with what's happened with Mace and losing the boys, and you, as you said, you knew all the boys, mate. You come back from the deployment ends, and one of the hardest trips that you've been on, and probably one of the hardest periods of your life, mate. And then you rotate onto tag with the rest of Alpha for the first time, mate. How are you alluded to, but how are you traveling mentally at this point as you rotate onto tag?
Mate, I'm, as I look back, I'm pretty solid. There was a lot in that trip, not as fantastical or as harrowing as that dig in Tunicalay when we lost Jace. But, there was a lot of incidences where the fear factor wasn't there, but the risk factor and the loss of life factor, I think, was there. And, just to name off a few, we went up to Gizab again, and, they called it the Gizab Revolt, and it was myself and one other and our little crew of mentor shooters and a patrol of SAS that went up there for us. And we kind of went up as a QRF element to support them. And as that kind of unfolded up there, there was a insurgency network that, it kind of, flex its muscle and, to kind of narrow down the narrative. There was, like some, the good guys of Gizab, we called them. And they were kind of, the neighborhood gang of good guys that were like, we're not going to handle this or put up with it anymore. We're going to take the fight to the insurgency network, Taliban, whoever. And, we were kind of caught in the middle. So when we went up there, it was a bit of a challenge to kind of figure out who was who in the zoo. We had the insurgency network that were pretty much dressed like the same guys that were the good guys. So, it turned out we had to get like, bloody, rags, like high-vis orange panel marker rags, and get them to tie them around their arms to let us know who was good and who was bad. So that really was that, that Green Beret US foreign internal defense kind of asking where you are truly going into, a foreign land and mobilizing locals to fight a problem of their own. So, we did that, and there were some decent skirmishes up there. Same story, just, decent little fights in their little freaking poppy fields and their freaking paddies of whatever freaking stuff they're, making. So that, and dealing just with the unusual lack of US support or Australian support on the ground, that was very, or I call it, I wouldn't say fun. It was very stimulating, but also worrisome at the same time. So, there's all those scars that are starting to be etched into my mind. And that one was before Shawali Cot. And then obviously when we lost the boys, when the bird dropped out of the sky. But, we had an attempted assassination on Matullah Khan after we lost Timmy, Scotty, and Chucky when I was down at what they called the Kandak, where Matullah Khan, that's where his police headquarters was. So we'd go down there and just hang out and just have that partnership and relationship, kind of building that trust that, we're Aussies, we're outside the wire of the big US Australian base. We're down here relying on you guys to protect us and show you guys that we trust you to take care of us. So when all that was going on, I was down there just hanging out with the guys and trying to migrate with, the Afghan guys. And yeah, we went out and, we're just out front working with the regular, population, just hearts and minds type of thing. And, MK, his, personal security detail with the, his up armored freaking white fleet vehicles rolls in the gate. And some cat just walks out from the backside of like a vegetable stand and just crumps himself off, blows himself from arsehole to breakfast. It was a failed hit on MK, but blitzed the vehicle and so on and so forth, crumped a couple of kids and a couple of civvies from TK. So, had that, in my mind, dealing with the aftermath of, picking up the scraps after that and kind of just coordinating a lot of that going on. So there was that. So coming back, I'll save you details on other ones. Maybe talk about, what I did up in Kabul with the New Zealand SAS later, and some of the stuff that I saw up there working with those guys was pretty interesting. Kind of based on, if you tap into Dan Fortune's podcast, he kind of talks about what the crisis response unit were doing up in Kabul. And myself and a couple of other guys went up there and worked with the New Zealand SAS doing that. But, a lot of that trip was pretty busy when it came to working more remotely without Australian guys around it. A lot of the time, like I said, it was just the other one that was with me with, a wagon that was surround me of Afghans that were, trained, but trained enough to make sure that if they did turn on us, we didn't give them all the tactics that they could override our Australian system, if that makes sense. So, you're on that point of giving them enough information to fight, but not enough to turn that fight against you. So, kind of giving you that lead up. Coming back to Australia, I was still good and I was excited about transitioning to tag again. I felt like I had good coping mechanisms in place, but, it was the residual effect of my young family and the distractions that brought me to start wondering, whether I've still got another, couple of years in the unit. So that was the mental games that I was working with, the effects of what I'd last seen on the trip, support network for my family starting to falter and taking a bit of that focus away from my job. So with that, when we get back, we've worked out the respect for Timmy and for Chucky and for bloody Scotty. They're starting to work out that system of dealing with the guys' long-term therapy and working for those that were wounded. Alpha regroups and restructures to begin its first full company-sized rotation from war roll to black roll. So this is them stepping straight into tag. Heston Russell, he's a pretty iconic public figure now. He was the platoon commander for that. I'm guessing, he kind of just cycled in off that recent Rio, I guess, and jumped in as the platoon commander for that one. And, as one of the more senior guys who had served in the tag, I had a lot of involvement in the preparation and train up for the company, and that involves all of the specialist courses to take on that counter-terrorism role. Your MOE, your breaching, your driving, a lot of the fast roping, your suspended extractions, all that sort of stuff. And, once all those skills have been acquired and taught to the company, that also broke down into, stuff like blowing in roping blows where you're blowing in windows from high-rise buildings. There's a lot of technical stuff that, a lot of these guys hadn't been exposed to, even though they had done ACQB. That black roll, it's a busy workload and it takes a lot of concentrated effort to get guys up to speed. So there was a lot of that. And then, once we got all that all culminates into a validation or a series to evaluate the competency of whether, the whole company can take over that role. And what that entails is like a weekish, maybe week and a half, very intense series of full mission profiles, testing competency. And, there's a lot of, the planning and the execution of, a terrorist crisis and how to conduct that resolution on ships, ferries, even going out to the airport in Sydney and hitting passenger planes, going down to Defence Plaza in downtown CBD Sydney and hitting high-rise buildings, doing the trains, hitting the train networks, the casinos, schools. So there's a lot of stuff, man, that you're just really covering her off on. And, it's a super intensive period. And I was also learning my new role in one of the more compartmentalized capabilities within the tag. And, just to keep that short and sweet, that was a new role for me to start working on. And that was super interesting and very, focus intensive to continue to evolve that capability. But that's where Toddy Chidgey, he was one of the newer faces that came into my team. And so I started to get to know Timmy Chidge on that one. Super good dude, man. So that was the evolution post that 2010 gig in a nutshell.
So, mate, I want to talk to you about 2011. You so you, as you say, you're pumped, like good year ahead coming up. But then, as you mentioned, family dynamic and things are changing, and you make the decision to discharge from the army. And how hard was that, mate? Because the army had, like, although you transitioned for a little period at the end of '08 and into '09, but this was this was transition out of the military. And how hard was it for you to find purpose after this is basically all you've known from when you were 17?
Yeah, mate, it was this one. I knew that this would be, the final stake in, my journey, mentally. And I think, with the unit in the path that it was going, I didn't, my family was a priority, but, guys that have operated at that level, they know what I'm talking about. You just can't have any distractions. So it wasn't just about me being available for my family, but it was me acknowledging the fact that the guys that I work with, they don't deserve to be operating with a bloke that, at a junior / mid-level command leadership position that just doesn't have his mind on the tools. So yeah, it was hard, mate. And I knew that I couldn't give the unit what it needed from me. So yeah, I moved back to the USA, and it was very hard as I thrived in that high tempo environment. That was my normal. It became my idle pace. Yeah, that was my regular. I changed so rapidly and lived so much life so quickly. It was challenging to slow down to the rest of the world's pace. And I found it hard to treat things like, lives didn't depend on it. Everything that I would be confronted by, whether it was going to the grocery store and, supplementing the household with whatever's appropriate to sustain the family a week, everything was now like hard that, if someone got in front of me at the grocery store, or if, someone cut me off in traffic, it was difficult for me to de-escalate from, but I need to be doing what I'm doing because, lives depend on it. And I don't know how to explain that. I'm sure, think tankers and experts can kind of decipher that, but, everything that was wired inside me was built around the worst case scenario. And then, getting on the off ramp and, having to deal with things where it's okay if you're a couple of minutes late to church, like that wasn't okay for me, and that would, play a huge role on my mental state, whether it was just internal or not, and that would really affect me. So yeah, that's where the transition for me started to begin, I guess. And, with all that said, mate, that transition, when I say transition from Australia to US had been concluded, but still being plugged in to the war on terror. That was when Osama bin Laden was SWAC, and that US raid led by US Navy SEALs in May 2011 went down. So again, that was a celebration that we finally, as a coalition, had caught that cat. But again, it fell back into that same mindset that I had with Chucky, Tim, and freaking Timmy, that, why wasn't I involved? Whether it was a capacity of, the US running it or not, I still wasn't overdoing doing my part. So, that's the path that I was dealing with now.
And mate, I want to touch on a couple of, in that same year, this is compartmentalized, like, it's compacting and mate, in a short space of, a 6-week period, You lose two guys that you'd served with for many, many years in the regiment. I'm talking about Brett Wood, DSM,
Yep.
MG, and Todd Langley, mate. Two guys that you'd served with, and you knew you were good mates with, mate. How did their deaths affect you personally?
So, again, still plugged in enough to the unit. And, we're now in a environment where the World Wide Web's readily available. It was pretty quick for me to find out when both Woodrow and Todd, we lost. And yeah, it was immediate. I was deeply saddened and returned to that feeling of guilt not being there. Saying that, isn't to say that, would have changed anything, but it's that unexplainable sense that I turned my back on my brothers by not serving alongside them, if that makes sense. And, on the other hand, they were just like me. And we spoke about how much we lived to do the jobs we did. So it just continues to compound like these polar opposite emotions of sadness with validation on, these guys were doing what they wanted to do, but it rips me apart. It rips me apart for the families. And here I am, smoking and joking stateside, living the high life while my boys are out there still freaking banging it in.
And yeah, I'm just going to pause and take a moment on that with you, mate, and just reflect on their memories. And like you say, you sort of have that, the guilt that you're not there. But I think, and I know as you know as well, those guys, they wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else.
No, and absolutely not, mate. They were where they wanted to be.
And that, as shit as it is, mate, and you know it too because you've lost so many good mates, you take a bit of solemn in that, in the sense that they were, they were where they wanted to be. They were taking the fight and, taking the fight to the war on terror and, taking bad dudes from the Badlands off the face of this earth and, banging it in, doing what you guys do and what warriors do, mate. And they died the warrior's death.
Yeah. And that, I say this as a peer and one that stood with them. That does give me a lot of, I guess, peace that, they were validated. It's not like these tragic stories that you hear of, guys, and there are guys that I mentioned where they've gone on operations, they've done their part, contributed as a warfighter on operations at the highest of highest, and then, they come home and, they're tragically killed by someone DUI driving home from, going to the grocery store, and it's like, what a waste. Both, we've lost them, but, if you want to quantify how they were lost, there's that conversation of, was it worth it or not? And, we get down into that bitter, twisted conversation, but I think you know where I'm going with that.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And we'll touch on, what those boys mean to you, all the guys' losses shortly. And I just want to quickly touch on, mate. So from late 2011 to 2015, you were doing PSD missions in Afghanistan and just talk me through, you don't have to go into like heaps and heaps of detail on it, but just talk me through the next part of your life.
Yeah, mate. So kind of just trickling off some of that emotion and wanting to contribute at whatever capacity I could. I knew I couldn't return to the unit, that being so far away, being Australia and me living stateside and having the responsibilities and priorities for my family through channels, through the unit, I went on and worked at the Australian Embassy in Kabul. And, I still needed to continue and have my hand in the fire, but not at such an intense capacity, right? So, the rotations that you're looking at, when I was doing it, you'd be home for a month and in country for 8 weeks. So 1 month on, 2 months on-ish. And, I kind of felt like I was still contributing, so I could still come home and, take care of the family. And there was a decent pattern there where, I wasn't really in the trenches, out in the provinces, getting amongst it. However, it was still a high threat environment. Kabul was progressively becoming more unstable, more so than when I was there, a year, 2 years-ish, when I was up there with the crisis response unit with the Kiwi SAS. And, just to kind of give you like the introduction, when I plugged into working at the embassy, I started, I got out in, May, I think it was May 2011, if I remember correctly. So I had a bit of time to uproot the family, get them stateside, get them settled, get a contract gig with the embassy, get my visas, get everything that was appropriate to get over there and start working. And so I think it was like I'd arrived early September, maybe, 8th, 9th September, whatever it was. And I remember the 13th of September of 2011, it was, this is information that, we kind of pulled later after the fact, but it was like the intended 10-year anniversary of 9/11. And, the insurgency network, whoever it was, collaboration of Taliban, other networks, fighters attacked multiple locations in Kabul. And this was, like a big welcome back to the war. And, we were there defending our key part of the puzzle in the green zone. But, the guys that went and resolved that on that day as the ground forces, there was some helo assets that were involved in that, were the crisis response unit guys with Kiwi SAS that, a couple of years prior, they were kind of like scratching it. Hey, what are you guys doing down in Oregon to train up your special response team as the TK or Tarankot SWAT? So, I'd been out of the game for a while. There's always questions of, we've lost Woodrow, we've lost buddy Todd. I've been out of the fight with the boys down, hitting it hard down in the provinces. But, that was like, welcome back to first grade. You're in Kabul and things are still getting pretty freaking sideways up here. However, little Andy Steele, have you made a contribution to the war effort? Turns out that the crisis response unit for Kabul, they're the guys that you came up for a week or so to help implement their training regime as, essentially Kabul tag that resolved the incident on that day. So, things started to round out, not 100%, but there was a bit of a, attaboy there, whether it was self-rewarded or not. I think it was, but it was like, yeah, you have made an effect to the war effort, whether you know it or not.
It's, mate, sorry, mate, you go.
Go for it, bud.
I was just going to say, like, a crazy next part and period of your life. And during this period, mate, as well, we've mentioned him throughout the podcast, mate. The death of Cam Baird VC MG, and on the 22nd of June 2013, he gets killed in action, mate, and an action that he will be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Mate, how did his death affect you? And how did you hear about it?
Yeah, so by this time, mate, just fast forwarding from, the September 2011, quick little rundown on how the embassy work kind of unfolded. You'll always start at that basic level. So I got on the contract working for the embassy. You start as a driver, as the car that's in support, whatever capacity that is, and I won't go too deep into tactics and whatnot. And then you'll graduate or progress through the positions in the protection team into your second in command or your assistant team leader. So I'd progress through the ranks to a team leader. So the protection officer specifically for the ambassador, who was John Philp at the time. So we'd been working together for a while, working on those diplomatic tours around the country, heading up to Herat, actually going down to TK, Karen Kout, and seeing the boys, from Commando, going to Kandahar, Bagram, Mustafazai Sharif, going up and seeing, where it all started. General Dahlstrom, who was one of the heavy hitters, whatever bloody movie the freaking US had kicked in Hollywood style, 12 Horses or whatever it is, where, that was the Northern Alliance with General Dahlstrom. So we'd go up and see him. So there was a relationship being built there with John Philp, for us going around and going around and working the battle space and having those relationships at the diplomatic level for Australia. So while all that was going on, how did I hear about it? I remember I'd gone down to the ambassador's residence from, where we would stage, and, I went in and, just, hey, this is the itinerary for the day. You good? You've got any changes, so on and so forth. And, he said, we just, we're gonna cancel it, Andy. We've lost another one of the boys. And I was like, oh, frick, who was it? Was it which side of the fence? Which side of the fence referred to? Was it, one of the conventional guys, RTF, MTF, with the reconstruction force, or the mentoring force? Because there was that green on blue stuff that was obviously going on, a lot of the IED threats and so on and so forth. And he was like, nah, it was one of and he knew that I was one of the two commando bucks. He goes, I want your lads, mate, if you want to sit down. And I said, oh man, yeah, I might actually. And he said, yeah, we just lost Cameron Baird. And man, like, I truly, mate, I nearly fell to the ground, mate. When I couldn't believe it, mate. I knew that you couldn't stumble over a name like Cam Baird. But, yeah, mate, I was, mate, even to now, like, man, I was freaking shattered. Yeah. So with all that, we kind of ceased ops on his itinerary for the day. I don't know where we were going, probably going to the US Embassy to paddle asses or whatever we were freaking doing. But he knew as soon as he told me that, he kind of mattered to me, and it was, standard procedure that if we lost any of the guys, the ambassador would go down to the ramp ceremony. So needless to say, he said, we need to get down there. So, that was part of our role as the diplomatic security team to kind of coordinate getting aerial assets to get down. And I think there were some issues with Australian aerial assets. And I know that one of the guys pulled some strings with one of the less obvious call signs that was a US call sign that we were doing some of the more reserved stuff, and I'll keep it at that. And they pulled some strings to be able to get a bird that was not military to get us down there. And myself and one other of the blokes that was good friends with Betty, we took John down for the ramp ceremony. And there was a lot of ex-commandos on that embassy job, working for the embassy, and there was a lot of ex-JASCATs as well there. So, it was a pretty tight group of guys that, if not hadn't worked with each other down south, worked pretty close intimately anyway. So a lot of us were working together from our past and previous experiences and service in the army. And, we were all deeply moved by the news of Cam, and we talk about the animosity or the competitive nature between the Saskats and the two Commando lads. But this was really something that brought us together, because it was another, punch in the guts. The Saskat guys, they knew Bairdy. He was awarded the MG in 2007 when Luke Worsley had passed away. I think that was close within the proximity of when Matt Locke passed away. So, Bairdy had already put himself on the map, within the SOCOM community within Australia. So, it wasn't like it was an unknown guy to the regiment guys either. So we had our own little ceremony up at Kabul, behind closed doors to commemorate Bairdy. And, when we were at TK, when we finally got down there, I spoke to the lads and got the rundown in detail. I had my suspicions on what happened and the nature of Bairdy, knowing him and, operating with him in the past. And he and I were very close in the beginning of our service, and we talked about a lot of things that, we both loved what we did, and we were living the dream and just had a passion for the job we were doing. And, he once said to me, he never saw himself growing old, which at that point, man, I just laughed about it and, just kind of shook it off. But yeah, man, he was an amazing soldier and a great leader. He was a gentle giant, man, that knew his strength, but never abused it. Like I said early on when we were talking about his response to Hands Clear, like, he had that ability, man, that, if there was someone that he knew that it was his duty to protect, like, he would take care of business, mate. But he'd be the gentle giant as well and help you out like he did, like I told you about when, we were working, versus early on in the year. I really felt like we were brothers, and, that type of guy, would protect you and do anything to help. He put himself in harm's way to protect that he valued. And, he wouldn't say things. He just acted upon it. So he didn't have to talk himself up. He didn't have to validate or confirm his actions. He would just do it. That's the kind of guy he was. And that is what he was doing that day, man. Fighting from the front with his lads. And, he was fighting towards a wounded brother that had fallen in battle. And, he was one of those guys that, you aspire to be. And, yeah, I miss him greatly. He would take the time to help me, like I said, with things that I wasn't picking up on in a classroom setting, helping prepare for exams. I remember, when I went through my demolitions course, he and I did our demolitions course, mate. He'd be the kind of guy that would help me with my explosive calculations, doing that sub 1 class when we fell upon the Holt family, working with range policies. That's the kind of guy he was, man. We used to go out on the town together and, like I said, we'd have like dance-off competitions against each other. He'd always win. He was a very versatile personality. So you'd have this strong, staunch warrior, but, he could let his hair down as well. We'd go to karaoke bars and sing. He'd sing Garth Brooks, Metallica, AC/DC. Just to continue to just go on, man. Like, he was the kind of guy, and in our unit, we were all, encouraged to have like a false identity. So you wouldn't really have to be confronted by, if you're out dealing with whatever, you don't have to really tell people, your job, for the protected identity. So, we'd create our own little cover stories about what we did and, instead of telling guys that we were part of the unit, one of his cracker stories when we were speaking to, people out on the town, he'd tell guys or girls, whoever it was, that he was the guy that put the apples on the stickers on the apple. Or he'd tell them that his dad was the one that invented post-it notes, and he was just heir to the throne. Stories like, he'd say that he was the guy that painted the lines on the footy field. That kind of guy that just had that kind of quirkiness that could always make you laugh. I think one of the guys, a lot of us used to drive past the 3 RAR gates that was on Holsworthy Barracks. And, if you turned your indicator on when you were driving past, the soldier that was on guard, he'd have to do like a formal, attentive drill maneuver and salute in preparation for you to pull into the barracks. We'd drive past and put our indicator on and speed off. They're the kind of mischievous acts that we'd run amok with. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the other one, man, which still to this day, anytime I go out and about and eat at a restaurant, there was a phase where Betty would take a pair of scissors to the chow hall and he'd eat his dinner with scissors instead of a knife and say that it was way easier to cut his food. So yeah, that always sticks in my mind, man. He always included people, especially, those that were left out. He treated the Afghans gently when we played volleyball with them. He wouldn't talk down to them. If we're out on the town, he'd approach the lonely people, whether they were blokes or birds, and he'd speak to them. He had a good heart. He was always such a fun, caring person, man. And he absolutely loved his footy. He loved his guitar, his music, that freaking hot rod that he had. He had some freaking hilarious fashion sense. But yeah, he was just a good-hearted dude, man.
Just, mate, I thank you for, I know how mate, throughout the whole podcast, mate, you've been so vulnerable and I thank you because, as people know, you guys are warriors, mate, but like these guys, mate, their deaths affect every single person, mate. And like, I can tell how close Cam was with you, mate. He was a brother and, he helped you and you guys, you went on the journey together, mate. Like you started with him, you served through the regiment with him and, probably one of my proudest moments, mate, was to have his dad on the podcast and talk about his son and Doug and, that, mate, I can tell you now, Andy, and I can tell you because you knew Cam, mate, that was probably the hardest interview I've ever done because I was only new to the podcasting world then and I was nervous and, I didn't know how it was going to go and it was the 8th anniversary of coming up to the 8th anniversary of Cam's death and and a couple of days before it was his 40th birthday and I walked into Doug and I said, look, I don't know how this is going to go. I really want to do Cam's memory justice and I want to give it the respect that it's due and I want to give you the respect, Doug. And he just pulled me in and said, mate, let's just see how we go, hey? And mate, that was it. And then, going full circle, Nick heard that podcast and that's how Nick came on the podcast, mate. And, it's opened the door to all of you guys. So I thank you, mate, for sharing that, and showing your vulnerable side, mate. I really, from the bottom of my heart, mate, I thank you.
Oh, mate. Like I said, it's just a privilege to be able to speak for Cam and allow that light to continue to shine for those that didn't have the opportunity to know what a warrior looks like.
100%. And, mate, we're getting near the end and, we're getting very close to the end now. And, mate, you also in the next year, you also lose, as you say, Todd Chidgey. And, his effect as well, mate. And, like that effect played a big part on you as well. And then you have, mate, you finally, in 2015, you finally transition away from PSD, military altogether. And so what are you doing now, mate? Because you're currently, in 2015, you go into the role that you're in now. And what are you doing now, mate?
Yeah, mate. But yeah, we lost Chidge. He was doing, essentially the mirroring version of what we were doing for the embassy in Kabul. And I think at that time, I'm sure Muzz could tap into this a little bit deeper than I could, but I'm pretty sure that was around the tenure of Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd were coming over. I know that I was dealing with Angus Houston as the retired Chief of the Defence Force, I think. So yeah, lost Chidge, within that period of space, and again, that knowing Chidge was another, snap kick to the throat. Not making it about me, but just expressing, how much it affects us who, beside them in that capacity. It still affects us regardless. But yeah, with regards to, I finally make that break from working in that hostile environment at the embassy. And, I'd say I'm close to, transitioning back to the world. At the moment, I work with the Department of Energy here in the US, and I'm still loosely affiliated with the type of work that I did when I served. And that allows me the ability to get on the tools, if I want. And I'll kind of leave it at that, just for a bit of classification on what I'm doing now. But
yeah,
that still allows me to, stand close to the fire with the hands on my hips. But, I can get in the fire and get amongst it if and when I need to scratch that itch.
Yeah, 100%, mate. No, and mate, I'll touch on your plans going forward with your family shortly, but mate, knowing what you know now and all that you have been through, what advice now looking back would you give your 18-year-old self, and would he listen?
Oh, mate, slow down and enjoy the milestones that I reach or have the potential to reach. Talking back to myself, don't be in a rush to reach the next summit. Stopping isn't always a bad thing. Take time for yourself and be okay to step back and enjoy the view. There was a lot of summits that I climbed that I just didn't stop, take that panoramic 360 view, smell the flowers. Be okay being a little more open to sharing my feelings with the ones that I love and the things that, that I'm struggling with. I feel like that matters, to be able to share that stuff. And I'd be naive to say that I would listen to it. I don't think I could say it, but, the young Andy Steele would be like, yeah, no worries, champ. Stay in your own lane. Worry about yourself.
Whereas, Andy, a little bit older and wiser now, reflects on that.
Yeah.
100%, mate. And, mate, how important has faith been throughout your military career and with post-service and transition?
Yeah, good question. Looking back, my faith, it really was the foundation and the only reason that I achieved all that I've done. It definitely wasn't my physical or mental strength that got me there, nor my intellectual abilities. Like I said before, mate, I'm always the dumbest person that walks into any room, and it's all because of him. JC, Jesus Christ, he was the one that has shown me the way.
Yep, 100%, man. And I'm back. You and I have you know how faithful I am too, mate. And yeah, certain things have happened in my life that, mate, if I didn't have faith, I wouldn't be here. And I truly, absolutely 100% agree with you there that, my struggles, Andy, how I was saved the day, it's coming up to 10 years ago. And that was the hand of God, mate, that kept me here to do what I do now and speaking to you guys and first responders and doing the work that I do, mate. I know exactly like you, mate, faith is the most important thing.
Yeah, completely, mate. Couldn't agree more.
100%. And, mate, what advice would you give to any young player who listens to this about joining Special Forces in preparation and also physically and mentally?
Yeah, it's a bit of a no-brainer. I'm sure now there's plenty of it out there. But, follow the PT plan. I don't think you have to dig too deep to get an idea of what the expectations are now. So that's pretty much plain text. And the one that follows on with that is take care of your feet. You're not going to go anywhere with those bad boys. So make sure you take a good, solid appreciation of taking care of your feet. Seek knowledge on high performance and high performance. In this day and age, like what we're talking about, find yourself an SF veteran to mentor you. There's a lot there that it wouldn't just be the individual that is inspired to follow in the footsteps of a SF operator for themselves, but it would be really a two-way street. I think it'd be very therapeutic for that veteran to be able to invest their time in creating a pathway for the next up-and-comers. I could rattle on about that in depth on giving them a purpose, but I think you get my point, mate.
100%.
You definitely be able to kill two birds with the one stone with that. The other one that I think about is you got to condition yourself to being uncomfortable and always being watched. Learn to perform under pressure and find your happy place and know your weaknesses and your why. And I'll unpack that a little bit. You've got to find your happy place because there's going to be a lot of times where you're unhappy and you've got to unlock that source of energy inside you to be able to keep yourself on track. Your weaknesses, you've got to be able to discover your weaknesses before someone else discovers them, because that's what selection's about. It's about discovering weaknesses and bringing them to the surface. So do yourself a favor and find out what they are. So you've got an appreciation of what they are before someone finds them for you. And the why. That's a big one, mate. I didn't really talk about this in my prep, but you've got to find a why. Just entering selection and saying, I want to have a career, working in special forces. That's not enough. You need something that is going to be forged so strong that whatever suffering that you experience, whatever pain you experience, it's beyond that. You have got to have a why, and I'm not going to give mine away because that was my secret antidote, and my faith plays a big part in that. But you've got to understand that the why is heavily intertwined with the matter that you produce on the day. And what I mean by that is, for thinking of someone like like a steel mason, someone that works with metal.
Blacksmith.
Thanks, mate. Blacksmith. You got to think of someone that's going to forge a piece of metal. You've got to be able to find the material that is the why. The matter that is the why is what you're going to produce as the piece of steel that is about to be prepared to be forged in that fire. that fire will turn you into what they want you to be, but that why is the matter that you need to turn up with. And you need to be able to identify what that is to make sure that it's strong enough to be able to forge that firing that you're about to experience. You've got to learn to be your own cheerleader. And when I say that, you've got to generate your own gold stars and trust yourself. I spoke about, when you're doing your little nav exercises, you're on your own. You don't have mum or dad or, someone, paddling your ass saying, hey, nice one, champ. You're going to get a pie and sauce, after, school today because you did a great job. Like, there is none of that. You're going to have people that are continually assessing you, and, that silent running, they're not going to tell you that you're doing great. They're not going to tell you that you're not doing good. They're not going to tell you if you keep going the way you are, you're going to be okay. You have got to be able to create your own gold stars and be able to find the ability to trust yourself in your own behaviors and abilities. And, I guess round it all out, understand you will not see the world the same after. And I think hopefully on this little conversational journey, I think I've established that I am not the person that I was when I stepped into this arena. And I think for guys that trying to discover that plan and that pathway and that why, that piece of steel that's about to be forged, there has to be an essence of matter in that recognizes and acknowledges that you are going to be different once you're in and then once you're spat out at the end.
100%. And it's something that Lang has said, mate, that if you're prepared to go down this path, be prepared that the SF world will bite hard, and you be prepared that you're going to, get ready because you're going to change. And well said, mate. Absolutely well said. And mate, I want to touch on looking back now, we've mentioned some amazing guys that you served with into Commando, and you lost 12 commandos killed in action and 1 killed preparing for deployment. How do you want how do you want the guys to be remembered here in Australia, and how do you remember the guys?
Yeah, I think of them every day in one way or another. I have a wall hanging, like a shadow box in my office with all of them on it. I do a memorial marathon, like a pack march, ruck march, for Americans that know what that is, every April up in the Smoky Mountains. And that gives me an opportunity, 26.2 miles, I don't know what that is in kilometres, 40-ish miles or kilometres. And, that gives me an opportunity to, get my feet on the pavement and suffer willingly. And through that suffering, really reflect on, the price that they paid and, the suffering that I'm experienced because of the price that they paid. So, that's one of the pieces that I really look forward to. It's a double-sided coin, that one, but, I get a lot of therapeutic value out of that. I naturally throw a few back on Anzac Day to the boys and think very specifically about every single one of them. I really reflect on them and make sure that I live a life worthy of living and that they would be proud of and not to waste it. I don't limit my thoughts just to be negative. I open my mind to wonder in positive ways too about them. I talk to them internally, in my own head, whether that's psychotic or not, and run decisions by them, too. Maybe crazy, but, I find they help me, in my own way.
Absolutely. No, mate. And I think us as Australians, mate, all we can do is get guys like you on who serve with them to remember who these warriors were, mate, and that they, they went out the way they wanted to they were, they went out the war and then they all pretty much died the warrior's death, mate. And that's how we should remember them as well.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, man. There's a lot of documentaries out there that have covered off on modern warfare, specifically Afghanistan. I think that if I had anything to do with the education system in Australia, that would be a default setting, watching one of the recent 3-part documentaries for, 9 grade, 10 grade kids to sit down and appreciate, what had been done. I'm sure, there's a lot of conflict of opinion on the withdrawal of Afghanistan, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But, I think, the up and coming generations, they need to be, forced, may not be the right word, but diplomatically driven to be obligated to learn about freedom and what the cost of freedom is.
Freedom's not free.
Take time to go to the War Memorial. Take time to go up to, whatever the local monument is of the service and the sacrifice that's been paid for, for these kids to have the freedoms of doing whatever they do, whether it's sitting on a device and, living life through that, or getting up and, participating in society. But the only reason that they have that freedom, whatever pathway they choose, is because, people that they don't know stood up and were willing to lay down their life for them to do what they ever choose to do.
100%, mate. Well said. And as you say, mate, freedom's not free. And there's been a lot of guys pay the ultimate sacrifice, and men and women. And, as you say, 103,000 names are on the War Memorial, mate. So freedom's not free. And yeah, it's something that we need to absolutely hold true to and remember all the sacrifice. And absolutely. And mate, with everything you've gone through, looking back now, was joining the army still the best decision you've made?
Yeah. Yeah, to me, it wasn't a job. It was my dream. I was alive in that environment, and I was surrounded by the best category of humans that you can find. It pushed me well beyond what I thought I was capable of. And, it used what everyone else in the world told me was a problem. And, I spoke about it, kind of brushed off, the OCD, the ADHD, self-diagnosed, those things through school, they were frowned upon, man. And the military, to me, it showed me that it was my superpower, and the people I served with made me who I am and the person that I'm proud of being today. And for those that are out there, like, you know who you are. I'm a product of rubbing shoulders with you.
100%, mate. 100%. And you're an absolute champion. And, mate, I've got a couple more questions, and then I've got a quote that I want to finish the podcast on, mate. And we've been recording for 7 hours and 12 minutes. So it's been an awesome, mate. Just to get your story is just absolutely amazing. And, mate, what are your plans going forward with your family and into the future?
What can I say about that? I guess, I've found my own slice of heaven out here in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. So, I like to live a quiet life, focusing on being the best husband and father that I can be. Like, that is now my center of gravity. That's my focal point. My mission now, I'm really interested in helping guys, I've come across that have served, deal with the challenges returning from combat, and living a life that all the guys that we lost along the way would be proud of for living, because, they paid for me to have it, plain and simple.
100%. 100%, mate. And, mate, how do people get in contact with you if they want to make contact with you?
Yeah, good question. For people that know me, they can reach out via email. People that know people that I know, I'm sure, they can reach out through that method of authentication. LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach out to me. I'm sure for the guys that know me, such as yourself, mate, I've got a pretty small social footprint, especially with social media and the World Wide Web. But yeah, if people are looking for me, they can find me through, people like yourselves, people that know who I am, or, if all else fails, hit me up through LinkedIn.
Yeah, nice. And yeah, mate, I'll happy to pass on if anyone does want to get in contact with you. More than happy to do that. So, mate, as I said, it's been an absolutely epic story, mate. And I want to finish with this quote that I believe sums you up. So, Andy, you've served your country with honour and brought pride to your family. Your story is one of true grit, true determination, having the courage to be brave and test yourself and succeed at the elite level. The quote is, be strong and courageous, for the Lord will be with you wherever you go, no matter what challenges you face. He will always be with you. Keep the faith. You are a true warrior. Andy, I believe this quote sums you up. And I want to thank you for your service to our country, and I appreciate you coming on True Blue Conversations and sharing your story. It's been an absolute honour and a privilege, mate, so thank you.
Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, mate.
We'd like to thank Tactical Recovery for sponsoring this show. Head on over to tacticalrecovery.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for one hell of a discount. Tactical Recovery, magnesium-based muscle care, salty products for sore fuckers. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Bloom. See you on the front line.